The Mythologies of All Races, Volume 3, Celtic, Slavic. Chapter 8, The Myths of the British Celts. The surviving myths of the British Celts, or Brythons, as distinguished from the Irish Celts, or Goidels, exist in the form of romantic tales in the Mabinogion and similar Welsh stories, and in the Arthurian and Taliesin literature, or are referred to in the triads and Welsh poems. Have the divinities who there figure as kings and queens, heroes and heroines, magicians and fairies, retained any of their original traits and functions? The question is less easily answered than in the case of Irish divinities subjected to the same romantic and euhemerizing processes. With religious and social changes, it was forgotten that the gods were gods, and they became more or less human, for the medieval storyteller was pillaging an antiquity of which he does not fully possess the secret. The composition of the stories of the Mabinogion, like those of the great Irish manuscripts, dates from the 10th and 11th centuries, yet, in both cases, materials and personages are of far older date. The supernatural element is strong, and there is a mythical substratum surviving all changes. Further, the Welsh tales belong to a systematized method of treating ancient traditions, and were the literary stock-in-trade of the Mabinogi, or aspirant to the position of a qualified bard. This process was still further carried out in Ireland, where myths were recast into a chronological as well as a romantic mould, the file, or man of letters, being estimated according to the number of his stories and his power of harmonizing and synchronizing them. In Welsh literature, the euhemerizing historical process is seen at work less in the legends than in the historians Nennius and Geoffrey of Monmouth, with whom some gods became kings having a definite date, as in the Irish Canals. Certain personages and incidents of Welsh story resemble those of Irish tradition. Was there, then, once a common mythology among the ancestors of Goidel and Brython, to which new local myths later accrued? Or did Irish and Welsh myths mingle because Goidels existed either as a primitive population in Wales, conquered by Brythons, or as a later Irish immigration? Probably we are right in assuming that the Mabinogion literature contains the debris of Brythonic myths, influenced more or less from Goidelic sources, as the occasional presence of Irish names and episodes suggests. The Arthurian and Taliesin cycles are purely Brythonic. What is certain is that the dim divinities of the Mabinogion are local in character and belong to specific districts in Wales. Gods of tribes settled there. Celtic divinities were apt to be local, though some had a wider repute. Few of the many British divinities mentioned in inscriptions are known to Welsh story. Nodons is Nud or Lud. Mapanos is Mabon. The Belinos and Taranos of continental inscriptions may be respectively Beli or Belinus and Taran of Welsh story, while the latter suggests the British idol called Heithurun in the Dyn Senchas. The Mabinogi of Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed, begins by telling why he was called Pen Anufin, or Head of Anufin, or Elysium. One day he observed a strange pack following a deer, but when he drove them off and urged on his own hounds, a horseman appeared, rebuking him for interfering with his sport. Pwyll apologized, and presently he and the stranger, Arawn, king of Anufin, agreed to exchange their forms and kingdoms for a year. Pwyll would have Arawn's beautiful wife and would fight Arawn's rival, Hafgun, giving him but one blow, which would slay him, for a second would resuscitate him. all this happened satisfactorily. Never had Powell's kingdom been so well ruled, and complete friendship was effected between the monarchs. As in Irish myth, this is the theme of a mortal helping a deity in the other world. Yet, Powell was once himself a god, as his title Pen Anufin denotes, and was later euhemerized into a king, or confused with an actual monarch called Powell, while Anufin here becomes a mere kingdom on earth. One day Powell sat on a mound which had the property of causing him who was seated on it to receive a blow or see a prodigy. A beautiful woman rode toward him and his men, who pursued but could not take her. This happened again on the morrow, but on the third day, when Powell himself pursued, she stood still at his bidding. She was Rhiannon, daughter of Hevaid Hen, and wished to marry him instead of Gwawel, whom she detested, and in a year he must come to her father's court for her. When Powell arrived, a stranger, who in reality was Gwawel, appeared demanding a boon of him, and on his promising it, asked for Rhiannon. She solved the difficulty by agreeing to be Gwawel's wife in a year, but bade Powell appear then as a beggar, carrying a certain magic bag, which, in the sequel, could not be filled with food. Gwawel was enraged, but was told by the beggar that unless a man of lands and riches stamped down the contents, it never could be filled. Gwawel did so and was immediately imprisoned in the bag, which was kicked about the hole by Powell's followers until, to escape death, he renounced his claim to Rhiannon. The magic mound is here the equivalent of the Cid, and such hills are favourite places for the appearance of immortals or fairies in Celtic story. Rhiannon, who suddenly appeared on the hill, was a goddess, like Fand or Conla's lover, and the theme is that of the fairy bride. The story now tells how Rhiannon, whose child disappeared at birth, was accused of slaying it and was forced to sit at the horse block of the palace, to tell her story to each newcomer, and to offer to carry him inside. Meanwhile, Tairnon, lord of Gwent is Coed, had a mare whose foals disappeared on May Eve, and this May Eve he saw a huge claw clutching the newborn colt. He severed it with his sword, and the intruder vanished. But at the doorway was a newborn infant, which Tairnon nurtured. Like Cuchulainn and other heroes, it had a rapid growth and was called Gwrry Golden Hair. Noticing Gwrry's likeness to Powell, Tairnon carried the boy to him, and Rhiannon was reinstated, exclaiming that her anguish was past. Whence Gwrry was called Pryderi and succeeded Powell as king. Folktale formulae abound in this section, that of the abandoned wife, found also in the Mabinogi of Branwen, and that of an animal born the same night as the hero, while the claw incident occurs in tales of Fionn. The importance of the story is in Pryderi's birth. The fact that Tairnon's foal disappeared on the same night as Pryderi, who was found at Tairnon's door, and the meanings of the names Tairnon or Tigernonnos, meaning great king, or Tigernnos, meaning chief, and Rhiannon or Rigantona, meaning great queen, may point to a myth in which they were Pryderi's parents. Manawyd Dan, who becomes Rhiannon's husband and rescues both her and Pryderi from the vengeance of Gwawel, may have been his father in another myth, for a poem associates him with Pryderi in Caer Sidi, a part of Anufin. In the story, however, Powell, an original lord of Elysium, is Pryderi's parent. Does this point to a number of goddesses bearing the name Rigantona, consorts of different gods, and later fused into one as Rhiannon? In another Mabinogi, Pryderi is despoiled of swine sent him by Araun, or of which, according to a triad, he was swineherd, Pwyll having brought them from Anufin and given them to Pryderi's foster father. Pwyll and Pryderi are thus associated with Elysium and with animals brought thence. A Taliesin poem tells of the magic cauldron of Pen Anufin, that is, Pwyll. Round it was a ridge of pearls. It would not boil a coward's food. Voices issued from it. It was warmed by the breath of 9 maidens, and it formed part of the spoils of Anufin, which Arthur and others made a long journey overseas to obtain. Gwair was imprisoned in Caer Sidi through the spite, or messenger, of Pwyll and Pryderi, associated as lords and defenders of Anfin. Araun, lord of Anufin, was defeated by Amaethon, son of Dawn, at the mythic battle of Cath Godeu. The Mabinogi of Math, son of Mathonwy, tells of Gilvetwy's love for Gawain, Math's footholder. To help him, his brother Gwydion resolved to cause war and told Math that swine, unknown before, had been sent to Pryderi in Dyfed by Araun. He and Gilvaethwy, disguised as bards, set off to the court of Pryderi, who praised Gwydion for his songs, whereupon the latter asked for the swine, but was told that they must breed double their number ere they left the country. Gwydion now obtained them in exchange for 12 stallions and 12 greyhounds magically formed by him from fungus. But these soon turned again to their original shape, and Pryderi invaded Math's territory, only to be defeated and slain in single combat by Gwydion's enchantments. Gilvaethwy outraged Gawain during the battle, and when Math discovered this, he transformed the brothers first into a couple of deer, then into swine, and finally into wolves. In these forms they had animal progeny, afterward changed to human shape by Math. Math now found a new footholder in Arianhord, Gwydion's sister, but she proved no virgin, and when Math caused her to pass under his magic rod, she bore twins, one of whom was taken by Math and called Dylan. When Gwydion brought the other, who had grown rapidly, to Arianhord's castle, she refused to give him a name. Disguised as a shoemaker, Gwydion then arrived with the boy and made shoes for Arianhord, which did not fit. She went on board Gwydion's ship, produced by magic, and saw the boy shoot a bird. Not recognizing him, she cried, "With a sure hand, Liu shoots the bird." Whereupon Gwydion revealed himself and said that she had named the boy Liu Lo Gifis. Now she refused to arm him, but once more disguised, Gwydion with Liu caused an enchanted fleet to appear, and she armed both, only to be taunted with the stratagem. Again she said that Liu would never have a wife of the people of this earth, but Math and Gwydion made him a bride out of flowers and called her Blodeuwed. She was unfaithful to Liu, however, and advised by her lover, Gronu Pebir, she discovered that a javelin wrought for a year during Mass on Sundays would kill him when standing with one foot on a buck and the other on a bath curiously prepared by the bank of a river. Gronu made the javelin, and when Liu, prevailed on by Blodeuwed, showed her the fatal position, he was struck by Gronu and flew off as an eagle. Soon after, Gwydion found a pig eating worms which fell from a wasted eagle on a tree. And as he sang 3 verses, at each the eagle came nearer. When he struck it with a magic rod, it became Liu, who now turned Blodeuwed into an owl. while Grenu had to submit to a blow from a javelin which penetrated the flat stone placed by him against his body and killed him. Leo now recovered his lands and ruled them happily. These personages are associated with a dim figure called Dawn, who is probably not male but female, and is mother of Gwydion, Gilvaethwy, Govanen, Amaethan, and Arianrhod, who was herself mother of Dylan and Leo. Math is Dawn's brother. Superficially, this group is equivalent to the Tuatha De Danann, and Dawn is parallel to Danu, while Govanen, or Smith, is the equivalent of Goibniu, the Irish smith god. Leo, the reading of whose name as Leo or lion may be abandoned, has been equated with Lug, and both names are said to mean light. Light, however, has no sense in the name-giving incident, and possibly, as Lott suggests, there is a connection with Irish Lu, or little. The other names of the group have no parallels among the Tuatha De Danann. Mythological traits are the magic powers of Math and Gwydion, their shape-shifting, and the introduction of the swine. Math Hen, or the Ancient, is an old Welsh high god, remembered for magic, which he taught to Gwydion. For the fact that the winds brought to him the least whisper of a conversation, wherever it might be held, and for his preeminent goodness to the suffering and his injustice without vengeance upon the wrongdoer. The last trait shows a high ideal of divinity, and the second a conception of omniscience. As a magician, Gwydion is also prominent, and by magic he governed Gwynedd. He was the cleverest of men and possessed terrible strength, while his prophetic powers are emphasized in a triad, and he had supreme gifts as a storyteller and bard. His successful raid on Pryderi's pigs, which came from Anaphin, suggests that, like Cuchulainn, he is the culture hero bringing domestic animals from the god's land to earth, and perhaps for this reason, a triad calls him one of the 3 cowherds of Britain, guarding thousands of kine. Irish myth also frequently speaks of cattle brought from the Cid. Gwydion's name reflects his character as an inspired bard, if it is from a root vet, giving words meaning saying or poetry, cognate terms being Irish faith, prophet or poet, and Latin vates. Gwydion would thus be equivalent to Ogma and Ogmios, gods of eloquence and letters, and a late manuscript says he first taught reading and knowledge of books to the Gaels of Anglesey and Ireland. He is not straightforward, however, when he pretends that his sister Arianrhod is a virgin, for she is his mistress and mother of his sons, an incest incident with parallels in Irish story. Arianrhod consented to the fraud and as a further pretense to chastity disowned Lugh. Yet a triad calls her one of the 3 blessed or white ladies of Britain. Was she worshipped as a virgin goddess, while myth gave her a different character? Celtic goddesses, like the Matres, were connected with fertility, and goddesses of fertility on earth are apt to possess a double character, like the great Phrygian mother, who was also regarded as a virgin. Arianrhod, like Aphrodite, was lovely. Beauty famed beyond summer's dawn, sang a poet. Her name means silver wheel. Much that is said of Lugh is insignificant for mythology, though Rhys has built a large structure of sun, dawn, and darkness upon it. The greater part of it is a well-known folk-tale formula attached to his name, that of the unfaithful wife. It is doubtful whether Lugh really equals Lugh merely because of their uncles are respectively Govanen and Gaveda, or Goibniu, both meaning smith, For while Gavida nurtured Lug, and Lug slew Balor, Leo was not brought up by Govanon, and the latter incident has no equivalent in his story. Moreover, Lug is prominent in connection with the great Celtic festival, Lugnasad, celebrated on the 1st of August, but Leo is not. Thus, his mythological significance is lost to us. Math caused Dylan to be baptized, and then this precocious baby made for the sea, where he swam like a fish. No billow broke under him, and he was called Son of the Wave. The blow which caused his death came from Govanon, one of the three nefarious blows of Britain, but is otherwise unexplained. The waves lamented his death, and ever, as they pressed toward the land, they seek to avenge it. Perhaps Dylan was once a sea god, regarded as identical with the waves, like Manannan. Tradition speaks of the noise of the waters pouring into the conway as his dying groans, and again like Manannan, son of Ler, the sea, he is called Dylan Eli Ton or Mor, son of the wave or sea. As soon as he entered the sea, he took its nature. Govanon's functions as a smith god are illustrated from a reference in Culhwch and Olwen, where his help must be gained by Culhwch to attend at the end of the furrows to cleanse the iron, though the meaning of this is obscure. In the Taliesin poem, he and Math are associated as artificers. Amaethon's name suggests that his functions were connected with agriculture, Amaeth meaning plowman or labourer. And this is illustrated by the fact that no husbandman can till or dress a certain field for Culhwch. So wild is it, save Amathian, son of Dawn. He will not follow thee of his own free will, and thou canst not force him. He also brought animals from the gods' land, a roebuck, whelp, and lapwing belonging to Araun, and this led to the Battle of Godeu, in which, aided by Gwydion, he fought Araun. Gwydion changed trees and sedges into combatants, as he had transformed fungus into hounds and horses. On either side fought personages who could not be vanquished until their names were discovered. But Gwydion effected the course of the battle by finding the name of Araun's mysterious helper, Bran, a mythic instance of the power of the hidden name, once it becomes known to another. Whether as a survival from myth or from later folk belief, the stars are associated with some of these divinities. The constellation of Cassiopeia is called Dawn's Court. Arianrhod is connected with the constellation Corona Borealis, and the Milky Way is termed Gwydion's Castle, because he followed it in chasing Blodeuwedd across the sky, an obviously primitive myth. The Mabinogion of Branwen and of Manawydden are connected and concern the families of Pwyll and Llŷr. The Llŷr group consists of his sons, Bran and Manawydden, their sister, Branwen, and their half-brother, Nisien and Envisnien. As Bran sat on a rock at Harlech, vessels arrived bearing Matholwich, king of Ireland, as a suitor for Branwen. He was accepted, and a feast was made for him in tents, for no house could hold Bran. But Evnisien, the mischief maker, mutilated Matholwich's steeds, and the king indignantly left, returning only when Bran gave him gifts, including a cauldron which restored life to the dead, though they remained dumb. This cauldron was obtained from two mysterious beings who came out of a lake in Ireland, the man bearing the cauldron, and the woman about to give birth to an armed warrior. But they and their descendants were so troublesome that they were imprisoned in a white-hot iron house, whence the pair escaped to Britain with their cauldron. An incident probably borrowed from the Ulster tale of the Mesca Ulad. Matholwich returned to Ireland with Branwen, and there, after 2 years, in retaliation for Evnisian's conduct, she was placed in the kitchen, where the butcher struck her every morning. She accordingly sent a starling to Bran with a message, whereupon he waded over to Ireland, his men following in ships and crossing the Shannon on his body. The Irish came to terms and built Bran a vast house, in which they concealed warriors in sacks. But Evnisian discovered this and crushed them one by one. Peace was now concluded, but Evnisian again caused trouble by throwing Branwen's child into the fire. In the fight which followed, the Irish were winning because they restored their dead in the cauldron, but Evnisian smashed it, though he died in the effort. Bran was slain, and 7 only of his people escaped, including Pryderi, Manawyddan, and Taliesin. Bran bade them cut off his head and bury it at London, looking toward France. And they reached Anglesey with Branwen, who died there of a broken heart. Meanwhile, Caswallawan, son of Beli, had usurped the kingdom, Bran's son also dying of sorrow. As Bran had advised, his head-bearers remained at Harlech for 7 years, feasting and listening to the birds of Rhiannon singing far overhead, and at Gwales for 80 years, the head entertaining them in a house with a forbidden door. The years passed as a day, until one of the men opened the door when their evils were remembered, and they went to London to bury the head. Manawyddan having lamented that he was landless, Pryderi gave him land in Dyfed and his mother Rhiannon as wife. All 3, with Kichwa, Pryderi's wife, were seated on a knoll when a thunderclap was heard. And as the cloud which accompanied it cleared away, they found the country desolate, without creature or habitation. Lack of food impelled them to seek a living as saddlers, shield-makers, and shoemakers successively, but they were always expelled by the regular craftsmen. One day they pursued a boar to a strange castle, and Pryderi entered, but trying to lift a golden cup, his hand stuck fast to it, nor could he move his feet. Manawyddan told Rhiannon of Pryderi's disappearance, and when she sought him, she met the same fate, until at another clap of thunder the castle disappeared. Manawyddan and Kichwa, as shoemakers, were again followed by envious cobblers, and he now sowed 3 fields, but an army of mice ate the grain. One of these he caught and was about to hang, in spite of the entreaties of Kichwa, of a clerk, and of a priest, when a bishop appeared, and Manawyddan bargained to give up the mouse if the bishop released Pryderi and Rhiannon, removed the enchantment for Dyfed, and told him who and what the mouse was. The bishop was Lluyd, a friend of Gwawel, whom Pryderi's father, Pwyll, had insulted. All had happened in revenge for that. The mouse was Lluyd's wife, the other mice the ladies of the court. Everything was now restored. Pryderi and Rhiannon reappeared, and Lluyd agreed to seek no further revenge. While the framework of Branwen is connected with Scandinavian and German sagas, whether borrowed by Welshmen from their Norse allies in the 9th and 10th centuries, as not supposed, or by Norsemen from Wales, its personages are Celtic, and it contains many native elements. Llŷr half-speech and Manawyddan are the equivalents of the Irish sea gods Ler and Manannan, the latter of whom is also associated with Elysium. It is uncertain whether these 2 were common to Goidels and Brythons, or were borrowed by the latter, but at all events they have a definite position in Welsh tradition, which knows of two other Leirs, Leir Marini and Leir, father of Cordelia in Geoffrey's history, Shakespeare's Lear. These are probably varying presentments of a sea god. Leir is sometimes confused with Lud, Lo, Ereint, or Silverhand. A triad represents Gwair, Mabon, and Leir as three notable prisoners of Britain. But in Culhwch, these are Great, Mabon, and Lud, father of Cordelia. Are Leir and Lud identical, and is an Irish Aloit, sometimes called father of Manannan, the equivalent of Lud? All this is uncertain. Rhys and Loth are tempted to correct Lud into Nud, and earlier Nodens Lamargentios, or Nud Silverhand, having been changed to Lodens, or Lud Lamargentios, by alliteration, and to equate him with the Irish Nuada Argetlam, or Silverhand. But the possibility of such an alliterative change has been denied. Nuada is identified with the British god Nodons. But though Leir was a sea god, there is no proof that Nuada or Nodons was such, though some symbols in the remains of the temple of Nodons on the Severn have been thought to suggest this. These, however, are not decisive, and it is equally possible with that the god was equated with Mars rather than with Neptune. Manawydan, whose name is derived from Welsh Manaw, the Isle of Man, is much more humanized in Welsh story than the divine Manannan of the Voyage of Bran. Yet he has magic powers and great superiority as a craftsman. He is associated with Arthur in a poem and is praised for his wise counsels, while Pryderi was instructed by him in various crafts and aided by him, just as the Irish Diarmaid was nurtured and taught by Manannan. Rhiannon may have been introduced accidentally into the story, a mere invention of the narrator in order to give sequence to the narrative. But possibly she is Manawydan's real consort, not one given him by her son. If so, Pryderi would be Manawydan's son, not Puel's, and his deliverance of Rhiannon and Pryderi from his magician foe would be significant. Rhiannon appears magically, like Irish goddesses of Elysium, and she may thus have been associated with Manawydan in Elysium, who with Pryderi is lord of Anaphin in a Taliesin poem. Complete is my chair in Caer City. Plague and age hurt not him who is in it. They know Manawydan and Pryderi. Three organs round a fire sing before it, and about its points are ocean streams, and the abundant well above it, sweeter than white wine the drink of it. Rhiannon's magic birds, whose song brought joy and oblivion for 7 years, like that of Leir's bird children, and awoke the dead and made the living sleep, have an Elysian note and confirm the supposition that she is an Elysian goddess. Beyond that we need not go, and there is nothing to connect her with the dawn or the moon. Branwen or Bronwen, white bosom, has no definite traits. Her marriage to Matholwich and her subsequent sufferings recall the stories of Gudrun, Cramhald, and Signy. But whether she ever was connected as a goddess of fertility with her brother's cauldron of regeneration must remain an ingenious conjecture, not supported by the Mabinogi. As a sea god's daughter, she may be the Venus of the Northern Sea, as Alton supposed, while the Black Book of Caermarthen calls the sea the fountain of Venus, though this is, perhaps, nothing more than a classical recollection. Later romance knew her as Brangwain, the confidant of Tristram and Iseult, giving the knight the love potion which bound him in illicit amour with Iseult. Bran is a more obviously mythological figure, and his gigantic size is an earlier or later method of indicating his divinity. His buried head protected the land from invasion, a mythical expression of actual custom, for bodies and heads of warriors had apotropic virtues and were sometimes exhibited or buried in the direction whence danger was expected. Hence, the image of a divine head might have greater powers, and this may explain the existence of Celtic images of a god's head, often in triple form. These figures, found in Gaul, were believed by Rhys to be images of Cernunnos, a god of the Celtic underworld, which he regarded as a dark region, contrary to all that we can gather of it, while Bran was the Brythonic equivalent of Cernunnos and was slain by a sun hero, his wading to Ireland representing his crossing the waters to Hades, like Yama, there to reign as Lord of the Dead. The heads, however, can be explained only conjecturally as heads of Cernunnos. The exigencies of the story demanded that Ireland should be brought in, and as Bran had to reach it somehow, it was easiest to make the gigantic god wade there. If the parallel with Yama were true, Bran should have died before crossing the water of death. Yama's realm was not dark, but a heavenly region of light, like the Celtic otherworld, even if the latter, unlike the former, was subterranean. Far from being dark, Bran is bright and cheerful and has Elysian traits. 8 years are as a day, and men think only of feasting and happiness in the presence of his head, which is as agreeable to them as he himself was in life. It produces an Elysium on earth, which is lost through opening a door, exactly as others lose it and become decrepit through contact with earth. Thus, if Bran, sitting on the rock at Harlech, or existing as a talking head afterward solemnly buried, like Orpheus' singing head interred in a sacred place, is the equivalent of the squatting Gaulish god Cernunnos, perhaps no also represented as a single or triple head. This can only be because both were lords of a bright otherworld, whether the region of the dead or a divine land. Bran is certainly not a dark god of blight, but rather the reverse, since his cauldron resuscitates the dead. In crossing to Ireland, he carried his musicians on his back, and this may point to his being a divinity of musicians and bards. If so, he, as the Uradol Ben, or noble head, may be compared to the Uther Ben, or wonderful head, of a Taliesin poem, which boasted of being a bard, harper, and piper, and equal to 70 professionals. Arthur disinterred Bran's head, not wishing to owe the defence of Britain to it. Bran was euhemerized into a British king who was confused with Brennus, leader of the Gaius in the sack of Rome, 390 BC, and was transformed into a conqueror of Gaul and Rome. He also figures as a saint, Bran the Blessed, if that was not already a pagan epithet, and remaining at Rome 7 years as hostage with his son Caradoc, he brought Christianity thence to the Cimmery. Caradoc is here the historic Caratacus, who was carried prisoner to Rome, but there is confusion with the Caradoc, meaning great arms, or prince of combat, son of Lir Marini, about whom a saga may have existed. In any case, Bran was regarded as head of one of the 3 saintly families of Britain. In the Mabinogi of Branwen, Caswallawn, clothed in a mantle of invisibility, destroyed the heroes of Britain and usurped the kingdom, leaving Manawyddan landless. And though his sister was married to Lir, he was hostile to Lir's descendants. Caswallawn, Lud, Levelis, and Nineveh were sons of Beli, although Geoffrey makes his Lir long precede Beli or Heli as king, while he also introduces a Belinus and confuses Caswalawan with Cassivelanus, Caesar's foe. Beli and Belinus may represent the god Belenos, who was equated with Apollo. And Beli is victorious champion of the land and the preserver of its qualities in the Taliesin poem, in which the singer implores him, perhaps a reminiscence of earlier divine traits. A triad calls Beli father of Arianrhod and Rhys, assuming that this is Arianrhod, the daughter of Dawn, makes Dawn consort of Beli, equates Dawn with Danu, and, without the slightest evidence, assigns to Danu as consort the shadowy figure Billy, father of Milli, invented by Irish annalists. Beli and Bille are then equated with the Celtic Dispater, the divine ancestor of the Celtic race, whom he assumed to have been a dark god ruling a dark underworld. All this is modern mythologizing. Caswalawan is confused in the triads with Cassivelanus, a warrior who may have been named after him, and he is called War King, an epithet which may recall his divine functions, those of a god invisibly leading armies to battle and embodied in chiefs who bore his name. Yet the epithet might be that of actual warriors, just as the German emperor calls himself the War Lord. Lud, as king, rebuilt London or Caer Lud, and was buried at Ludgate Hill, which thus preserves his name and points to an earlier cult of Lud at this place. He is also said to have been enclosed in a narrow prison, an unexplained reference to some tale now lost. In the story of Lud and Levelis, his country of Britain was subjected to 3 plagues. The Coranians who heard every whisper, like Math Hen, a shriek on May Eve caused by a foreign dragon attacking the dragon of the land and producing widespread desolation, and the mysterious disappearance of a year's supply of food. Levelis bade Lud bruise certain insects in water and throw the mixture over his assembled people and the Coranians. The latter alone would be poisoned by it. The dragons were to be made drunk with mead and then buried. The 3rd plague was caused by a magician who lulled everyone to sleep and then carried off the provisions. But Lud was to keep awake by plunging into cold water and then to capture the giant, who would become his vassal. This last plague recalls the hand of glory, the hand of a newborn infant or a criminal, which, anointed with grease and ignited, rendered a rubber invisible and caused everyone to sleep in whatever house the thief entered. Treasure was also discovered by its means, and as Douster Swivel in Scott's Antiquary said, "He who seeks for treasurish shall never find none at all," to which the antiquary replied, "I dare take my corporal oath of that conclusion." Whether this episode of the story is based on such a folk belief is not clear. As a whole nation suffers from the plagues, and as 2 of them affect fertility and plenty, the origin of the tale may be found in the mythical contest of divine powers with hostile potencies of blight, as at Mag Turid. In a triad, the plague of the Coranians is called that of March Malayan, from beyond the sea, and March suggests the Fomorian Mork, who taxed the Nemedians in 2/3 of their children, corn, and milk on November Eve. The Welsh plagues, however, occur at Beltane, that is, at the beginning of summer, rather than winter, as might be expected. Lud is praised for generosity in giving meat and drink, the attribute of a kindly god. The Coranians are connected with Welsh Cor, or dwarf, and are still known as mischievous fairies. In connection with such dwarfs, it is interesting to note that a dwarf fairy folk is described by Giraldus Cambrensis, 1147 to 1223. Two of them took the priest Elidurus, when a boy, through subterranean passages to a delightful region, whose people lived on milk and saffron, swore no oaths, and contemned human ambition and inconstancy. Elidurus frequently visited them, but being persuaded by his mother to steal their gold, he was pursued and the gold was taken from him, after which he never again found the way to fairyland. Save for their size, these fairies recall the Tuatha De Danann, dwelling in the Sid. Gwyn, son of Nud, is connected both with Anfinn and also in later belief with fairyland. He was a great magician and a mighty warrior, the hope of armies, while his horse was also the torment of battle. Without him and a certain steed named Du, the monster bull, the Twirch Twirth could not be caught by Culhwch. Gwyn abducted Greidlad or Cordelia, daughter of Lud, who was affianced to Gwythyr. But in the fight which followed, Gwyn was victor and forced one of his foes to eat his father's heart, so that he became mad. Arthur interfered, however, and ordered that Creidilad should remain with her father, while Gwyn and Gwythyr must fight for her every day until doom, when she would be given to the victor. This story is illustrated by folk survivals. On May Day in the Isle of Man, a girl representing the May Queen was attended by a captain and several others, and there was also a Queen of Winter with her company. The two bands met in mock battle, and if the May Queen was captured, her men had to ransom her. Ritual combats between representatives of summer and winter occur among the folk everywhere and in origin symbolize the defeat of winter, as well as actually aided the gods of light and growth. The story of Creidilad is perhaps the debris of an old myth explaining the reason of such a contest when its real purpose was forgotten. Another group of divine personages is found in the Hannes Taliesin, which was written in the 16th or 17th century, although references to incidents in it occur in far earlier poems in the Book of Taliesin and presuppose its existence in some form when they were composed. It contains mythical elements which introduce all divinities, a culture hero or god, Taliesin, and the conceptions of inspiration, rebirth, and shape-shifting, the last being expressed in the folk tale formula of the transformation combat, as it already is in one of the poems. Taliesin is unknown to the Mabinogion, save as a bearer of Bran's head, and this suggests his local character, while the saga was probably developed in a district to the south of the estuary of the Defi. Before story or poem was written, 3 facts concerning his mythic history must have been remembered: his inspiration, his shape-shifting powers, and his being the rebirth of Gwayan. Whether or not there was an actual poet called Taliesin living in the 6th, or, as his latest translator and commentator, Mr. J.G. Evans thinks, in the 13th century, it is certain that his poems contain many mythical references which must once have been told of a mythical being doubtless bearing the same name as himself. Tegid the Bald lived in Lake Tegid, or Bala, with his wife Ceridwen, their beautiful daughter Creirwe, and their sons Morvran and Avagdu, the latter the most ill-favoured of men, although Morvran, or sea crow, is elsewhere said to have also been of repellent aspect. Ceridwen wished to compensate Avagdu by giving him knowledge, so that he might have entry among men of standing, and with the aid of the books of Virgil, she prepared a cauldron of inspiration and science to boil for a year. While she went to gather herbs of virtue, she set the blind Mordu to kindle the fire and Gwain to stir the pot. But 3 drops fell from it on his finger, which he put in his mouth, and he found himself master of knowledge, which taught him to flee from Ceridwen's rage. Here follows the incident of the transformation combat, with the goddess as a hen finally swallowing Gwain as a grain. She later gave birth to him, and wrapping him up in a hide, placed him in the sea. At Gwaithno's weir the value of £100 was found every 1st of May, and Elphin was to obtain whatever was discovered on the next occasion, which proved to be the child. When the package was opened, Gwaithno exclaimed, "Here is a fine or radiant brow, or fine prophet, Tal Iesin," whence Elphin named the child Taliesin, and the infant sang and showed how deep was his knowledge. He was nurtured by Elphin and became one of the greatest of bards. Now Elphin had boasted at court that he had a more virtuous wife and a better bard than any there, whence he was imprisoned until his claim was verified. Rune was sent to seduce his wife, but Taliesin put a servant in her place, and she fell victim to Rune, who cut off her finger with her mistress's ring. When Elphin was confronted with it, he showed an ingenuity equal to that of Sherlock Holmes in proving that the finger was not his wife's. The ring was too tight, the fingernail was uncut, and on her finger some flour had remained from her baking. Now his wife never baked. She cut her fingernails weakly, and the ring was loose even on her thumb. Taliesin next came forward, and by his spells made the other bards utter nonsense. He sang of his origin, the region of the summer stars, his existence in long past ages, from that of Lucifer's fall to the days of the patriarchs, and his life at the nativity and crucifixion of Christ, and referred to his birth from Ceridwen. Then the castle shook. Elphin was summoned, and as Taliesin sang, his chains fell from him. The latter part of the story is purely romantic, but in poems ascribed to Taliesin, and in a triad, his greatness as the chief of bards appears. With me is the splendid chair, the inspiration of fluent and urgent song. He has been with the gods and ranks himself as one of them, telling how he was created and enchanted by them before he became immortal. He has a chair not only on earth but in the gods' land. Taliesin was the ideal bard, a god of inspiration like Ogma, and, besides his reincarnation, his birth from Ceridwen shows his divine nature. Yet, like other semi-divine personages connected with inspiration or culture, he obtains his powers by accident or by force. One myth, that of the cauldron, shows the former and is parallel to the story of Fionn and the salmon. But in another, darkly referred to in a poem, he with Arthur and many companions goes overseas to Caed City for the spoils of Anfin, including the cauldron of Pen Anfin. Here, whether successfully or not, the gifts of culture and inspiration are sought by force or craft. Our 2 separate myths are combined in the Hannes Taliesin, one making Taliesin son of a goddess with an abode in the divine land, the other viewing him as a culture hero, stealing the gifts of the god's land, and therefore obnoxious to Ceridwen? And if so, do these myths reflect the encroachment of the cult of a god on that of a goddess, his worshippers regarding him as a son, her worshippers reflecting their hostility to the new god in a myth or her enmity to him? Taliesin was supreme in shape-shifting and rebirth. Of no other Brythonic god or hero is the latter asserted. and several poems obscurely enumerate various forms which he assumed and recount his adventures in them. When, however, the poet, speaking his name, asserts that he has been a sword, tear, word, book, coracle, etc., it is obvious that this is mere bardic nonsense and not pantheism, as some have suggested. The claims of Taliesin and of the Irish Amergin resemble those of the Eskimo Angakok, who has the entry of the other world and can transform himself at will. And the gift of transformation and rebirth is then associated with inspiration in the Hannes Taliesin. Here the equation with Fionn and Oisin, already noted by J. G. Campbell and accepted by Rhys, is worth observing. Fionn and Gwaun obtain inspiration accidentally. Fionn is reborn, not as Oisin, but as Mongan, and Gwaun as Taliesin. Oisin and Taliesin are both bards, and Oisin's name is perhaps equivalent to Essin or Aesin in Taliesin. Taliesin's shape-shifting has no parallel with Fionn or Oisin, but Oisin's mother and, in one tradition, Fionn's also became a faun. Thus, inspiration, rebirth, and shape-shifting are attached to different personages in different ways, showing that mythical elements common to the Celtic race have been employed. Tegid is a god of the world under waters, but is not otherwise known to existing myth, though he and Ceridwen, possessor of a cauldron, are perhaps parallel to the giant pair out of a lake with their cauldron in Branwen, Ceridwen being a local goddess of inspiration, as a cauldron of knowledge shows. The Celtic mythical cauldron, bestowing knowledge, plenty like Dagda's, and life, like Bran's, is recognizable as a property of the god's land. But it was dangerous, and the bard sings of his chair being defended from Ceridwen's cauldron. Ceridwen was regarded as a daughter of Ogirven, from whose cauldron came 3 muses, and who was perhaps an eponymous deity of the elements of language, poetry, and the letters of the alphabet, called Ogirvens, as well as a god of bards. Ceridwen is styled the Ogirven of various seeds, those of poetic harmony, the exalted spirit of the minstrel. But Ogirven also means a spiritual form, a personified idea, and may here be equivalent to goddess. Thus Ceridwen was a deity of inspiration, like Bridget, though, like other Celtic goddesses, her primary function may have been with fertility, of which the cauldron, supplying plenty and giving life, is a symbol. She is also called a goddess of rain. Tegid's waterworld is the land under waves of Irish myth. One aspect of Elysium, examples of which have already been considered. Another instance occurs in the voyage of Maelduin, where the voyagers reach a sea beneath which is descried a country with castles, men, and cattle. But in a tree is a great beast eating an ox, and the sight so terrifies them that they sail quickly away. In another story, Munro is invited to come below the waters. He dives down and reaches the land of King Underwaves, whom he sees sitting on a golden throne. A year spent there feasting seems but a few days. Welsh tradition has also many stories of water worlds, as well as of fairy brides, daughters of the Lord of the Lake, and cattle which came thence. In a Christianized Irish version of the conception of a bishop from time to time visited a monastery beneath the waters of a lake, finally disappearing from his own monastery, none knew whither. Chapter 9. The Divine Land. Elysium, called by many beautiful Celtic names, is the god's land and is never associated with the dead. The living were occasionally invited there, however, and either remained perpetually or returned to earth, where sometimes they found themselves decrepit and aged. Time had lapsed like a dream, because they were in the immortal land and had tasted its immortal food. Many tales already cited have shown different conceptions of this situation. In the Cid, on a mysterious island, or beneath the waters, or the gods created on earth or produce it by glamour to mortal eyes. Occasionally such conceptions are mingled. These legends have illustrated its marvelous beauty, its supernatural fruit trees and music, its unfailing and satisfying food and drink, and the deathless glory and youth of its people. The tales now to be summarized will throw further light upon its nature. The first of these, the Voyage of Bran, is an old pagan myth retold in prose and verse in the 7th or 8th century by a Christian editor, interested in the past. Bran, son of Febo, one day heard music behind him produced by a woman from unknown lands, that is, from Elysium. Lulled by its sweetness, he slept, and on awaking found by his side a musical branch of silver with white blossoms. Taking it into his royal house, he there saw the woman, who sang of the wondrous isle whence she had brought the branch. 4 feet of white bronze upheld it, and on its plains were glistening, coloured splendours. Music swelled there. Wailing, treachery, harshness, grief, sorrow, sickness, age, and death were unknown. An exquisite haze hung over it, and its people listened to the sweet music, drinking wine the while. Laughter pealed there, and everlasting joy. Thrice 50 islands lay to the west of it, each double or triple the size of Erin. The woman then prophesied of Christ's birth, and after she had urged Bran to sail till he reached Tir Nam Ban, or the land of women, she disappeared, the branch leaping from Bran's hand into hers. Next day Bran sailed with 27 men, and on the voyage they saw Manannan driving his chariot over the waves. The god sang to the voyagers and told how he was passing over a flowery plain, for what Bran saw as the sea was to Manannan a plain. The speckled salmon in the sea were calves and lambs, and steeds invisible to Bran were there also. People were sitting, playing, and drinking wine, and making love without crime. Bran's coracle was not on the waves, but on an immortal wood, yielding fruit and perfume. The folk of that land were immortal and sinless, unlike Adam's descendants, and in it rivers poured forth honey. Finally, Manannan bade Bran row to Tir Nam Ban, which he would reach by sunset. Bran first came to an isle of laughter, and when one of his men was sent ashore, he refused to leave the laughing folk of this isle of joy. At the land of women, their queen welcomed Bran, throwing a ball of thread which cleaved to his hand, and by which the boat was drawn ashore. All now went into a house where were 27 beds, 1 for each. The food never grew less, and for each man it had the taste which he desired. They stayed for a year, though it was in truth many years. But homesickness at last seized one of them, Nechthan, so that he and the others begged Bran to return. The queen said they would rue this, yet, as they were bent on going, she bade them not to set foot on Erin, and to take with them their comrade from the Isle of Joy. When Erin was reached, Bran told his name to the men gathered on the shore, but they said, "We do not know him, though the voyage of Bran is in our ancient stories." Nechthan now leaped ashore, but when his foot touched land, he became a heap of ashes. Bran then told his wanderings and bade farewell to the crowd, returning presumably to the divine land. From that hour his wanderings are not known. Manannan's land overseas is the subject of a conventionalized tale in the Colloquy of the Ancients, which contains primitive material. One of Fion's men, Siabhan, embarked with 2 youths, Lodan and Iolus, sons of the kings of India and of Greece, and during a storm, Manannan appeared riding over the waves. For the space of 9 waves he would be submerged in the sea, but would rise on the crest of the 10th, and that without his breast or chest wetted. He rescued them on condition of fealty to himself, and drawing them on his horse, brought them to the land of promise. Having passed the Loch of Dwarfs, they came to Manannan's stone fort, where food, wine, and music delighted them, and where they saw Manannan's folk perform many tricks, which they themselves were able to imitate. In the land of promise were 3 beautiful sisters, Clinda, Aiphe, and Edain, who eloped with the visitors in 2 boats, Clinda going along with Siabhan. When he reached Erin, he went ashore to hunt, and now a great wave, known even after as Clinda's wave, rolled in and drowned her, overwhelming at the same time Manannan's men, Ildad Touch and his sons, both in love with Clinda and following in pursuit of her. A different account of Clinda has already been cited. In the story of Bran, the queen goddess fell in love with him and visited him, as in the legend of Connla, to induce him to come to her. While there are hints of other inhabitants, women or goddesses alone exist on this island, an additional parallel to the story of Connla, though there the island has a king, to the incident in Maelduin, and to the name Land of Ever-Living Women in the Din Senchas of Tuag in Bir. Another instance occurs in a Fionn story. Fionn and his men were hunting when there met them a huge and beautiful woman, whose finger rings were as thick as 3 ox goads. She was Bebion from Maiden's Land in the west, where all the inhabitants were women, save their father, its king, and his 3 sons. And for the 3rd time she had escaped from her husband, son of the king of the adjacent Isle of Men, and had come to seek Fionn's protection. As she sat by him and Gaul, however, her huge husband came, and slaying her, eluded the hero's pursuit, vanishing overseas in a boat with 2 rowers. The tradition of the Isle of Women still exists in Celtic folklore. Such an island was only a part of the divine land and may have originated in myth from actual custom. Women living upon or going at certain periods to small islands to perform rites generally taboo to men, a custom to which reference is made by Strabo and Pomponius Mela. That the gods could create an Elysium on earth has been found in the story of Lugh and Deictir, and another instance occurs in the tale of Cormac mac Art, king of Ireland in the 3rd century, of whom an annalist records that he disappeared for 7 months in 248 AD, a reference to the events of this story. To Cormac appeared a young man with a branch from which hung 9 apples of gold, and when this was shaken, it produced strange music, hearing which everyone forgot his troubles and fell asleep. He came from a land where there was naught save truth, and where was no age, nor decay, nor gloom, nor sadness, nor envy, nor jealousy, nor weeping. And Cormac said that to possess the branch he would give whatever was asked, whereupon the stranger answered, "Give me then thy wife, thy son, and daughter." Cormac agreed, and now told his bargain to his wife, who, like her children, was sorrowful that he should have preferred the branch to them. The stranger carried off successively daughter, son, and wife, and all Ireland grieved, for they were much loved. But Cormac shook the branch, and the mourning ceased. In a year, desire to see his wife and children came to the king. He set off, and as he went, a magic mist surrounded him, and he saw a house in the midst of a wonderful plain. After witnessing many marvels, he reached another house where a huge and beautiful man and woman offered him hospitality. Cormac bathed, the hot stones going into the bath water of themselves, and the man brought in a boar, while Cormac prepared the fire and set on a quarter of the beast. His host approached that he should tell a tale, at the end of which, if it were true, the meat would be cooked. But Cormac asked him to begin first. "Well then," said the host, "the pig is one of 7, and with them I could feed the whole world. When one is eaten, I place its bone in the sty, and next day it is alive again." This tale proved true, because the meat was already cooked. When the second quarter was placed on the fire, the host told of his corn which grew and gathered itself, and never grew less, and thus a second quarter was cooked. A third quarter was set on, and now the woman described the milk of 7 cows, which filled 7 tubs, and would satisfy the whole world. Her tale also proved true. And now Cormac realized that he was in presence of Manannan and his wife, because none possessed such pigs as he, and he had brought his wife and her cows from the land of promise. Cormac then told how he had lost his wife and children. A true story, for the 4th quarter was found cooked. Manannan bade him eat, but when he refused, for he would never dine with 2 persons only, the god opened the door and brought in his wife and children, and great was their mutual joy. Manannan now assumed his divine form and related how he had brought the branch because he desired Cormac to come hither, and he also explained the mystery of the wonders seen by him. When they sat down to eat, Manannan produced a tablecloth on which appeared whatever food was demanded, and a cup. If one told a lie, it would break, but if truth was then spoken, it would be restored. And to prove this, he informed Cormac that his lost wife had had a new husband, whereupon the cup broke. "My husband has lied," cried the goddess, and at her words the cup was repaired. Manannan then said that the tablecloth, cup, and branch would be Cormac's, and that he had wrought magic upon him, in order that he might be with him that night in friendship. In the morning, after a night's sleep, Cormac and his family found themselves no longer in the divine land, but in their own palace of Tara, and beside him were the cup, branch, and tablecloth which had covered the board of the god. Cormac's recognition of the god through his swine shows knowledge of the myth of the god's food. The Mukka Manhanain, to be killed and yet to be alive for evermore. A story told of Mongan has some resemblance to that of Cormac. He commiserated a poor bardic scholar, bidding him to go to the Cid of Lethet Oedni and bring thence a precious stone as his, as well as a pound of silver for himself and a pound of gold from the stream beside the Cid. At Tu Cid on his way, a noble-looking couple welcomed him as Mongan's messenger, and a similar pair received him at the Cid of Lethet Oedni, where was a marvellous chamber. Asking for its key, he took thence the stone and silver, and from the river he took the gold, returning to Mongan, who bestowed the silver upon him. Another story of Mongan relates how he, his wife, and some others, entering a mysterious house during a storm, found in it 7 conspicuous men, many marvellous quilts, wonderful jewels, and 7 vats of wine. Welcome was given to them, and Mongan became intoxicated and told his wife his adventures, or frenzy, from the telling of which he had formerly asked a respite of 7 years. When they woke next morning, they found that they had been in the house a full year, though it seemed but a night. In this instance, however, the house had not disappeared. Examples of beautiful places vanishing at daybreak are found in Fionn tales and also in the Grail romances. The seeker of the Grail finds himself no longer in the Grail castle in the morning, and the castle itself has become invisible. Such creations of glamour were probably suggested by dreams, whose beauty and terror alike vanish when one awaketh. Fruit-bearing musical trees, in whose branches birds are constantly singing, grow in the gods' land. In the Cid of Oengus were 3 trees always in fruit, and there were also 2 pigs, one always living, and the other always cooked and ready for eating, the equivalent of the Mukka Manhanain, or pigs of Manannan, and a jar of excellent beer, Goibnus ale. None ever died there. The Elysian ale is doubtless a superlative form of the Irish cuirm, or braccat, made from malt, of which the Gauls had a divinity, Brassiaca, and it is analogous to the Vedic soma and the wine of Dionysus. Within the Cid, or the god's land, were other domestic animals, especially cows, which were sometimes brought thence by those who left it, or were stolen by heroes or by dwellers in one Cid from those of another. Where mortals steal them, there is a reminiscence of the mythical idea that the elements of civilization were wrested from the gods by man. Cauldrons were used by the Celts for domestic and sacrificial as well as other ritual purposes, and these also gave rise to myths of wonderful divine cauldrons like Dagdas, from which no company ever went unthankful. Their contents restored the dead or produced inspiration, and they were stolen from the god's land, example, by Cuchulainn and by Arthur. The cauldron rimmed with pearls which Arthur and his men sought resembles the basin with rows of carbuncles on its edge in which, according to another story, a fairy woman washed. The inspiration of wisdom was obtained in the god's land, either by drinking from a well or by eating the salmon in it. But this knowledge was taboo even to some members of the divine land. Such a well, called Conla's Well, was in the land under waves, and thither Sinend, granddaughter of Ler, went from the land of promise to behold it. Above it grew hazels of wisdom, bearing leaves, blossoms, and nuts together, and these fell into the water, where they were eaten by salmon, the salmon of knowledge of other tales. From the well sprang 7 streams of wisdom, and Sinend, seeking understanding, followed one of these, only to be pursued and overwhelmed by the fount itself. Sometimes these hazels were thought to grow at the heads of the chief rivers of Erin. Such a fountain with 5 streams, their waters more melodious than mortal music, was seen by Cormac beside Manannan's house. Above it were hazels, and in it 5 salmon. Nuts also formed part of the food of the gods in the story of Diarmaid and Grain, and in a tale from the Dint Senchas, they are said to be eaten by the bright folk and fairy hosts of Erin. Another secret well stood in the green of Cid Nechtain, and none could approach it without his eyes bursting, save Nechtan and his cupbearers. Boan, his wife, resolved to test his power or, in another version, to prove her chastity after adultery with Dagda, and walked round it thrice with her shins. But 3 waves from it mutilated her. She fled, and was drowned in the pursuing waters. Goddesses sometimes took the form of birds, like the swan maidens of universal myth and folk tale, and they sang exquisite, sleep-compelling melodies. Sweet, unending bird music, however, was a constant note of Elysium, just as the song of Rhiannon's birds caused oblivion and loss of all sense of time for 80 years. In the late story of Thegue's voyage to Elysium, the birds which feasted on the delicious berries of its trees are said to warble music and minstrelsy, melodious and superlative, causing healthful slumber. While in another story, the minstrel goddess of the Cid of Dún Buidhe visited other Cide with the birds of the land of promise, which sang unequalled music. The lords of the Cid Elysium were many, but the chief were Dagda, Oengus, and Medir, as Araun in Brythonic story was king of Anfin. In general, however, every Cid had its own ruler, and if this is an early tradition, it suggests a cult of a local god on a hill within which his abode was supposed to be. Manannan is chief, par excellence, of the island Elysium, and it was appropriate that a marine deity should rule a divine region, including thrice 50 islands. In that land he had a stone fort with a banqueting hall. Lugh, who may be a sun god, was sometimes associated with the divine land, as the solar divinity was in Greek myth, and also with Manannan. And he with his foster brothers, Manannan's sons, came to assist the Tuatha De Danann, riding Manannan's steed before the fairy cavalcade from the land of promise. He also appeared as owner of an Elysium created by glamour on Earth's surface, where Conn the 100 Fighter heard a prophecy of his future career, this prophetic, didactic tale doubtless having an earlier mythic prototype. The Brythonic Elysium differed little from the Irish. One of its names, Anfin, or the Not World, which was Is Elfid, or beneath the world, was later equated with Hades or Hell, as already in the story of Gwain. In the Mabinogi of Pwyll, it is a region of this world, though with greater glories, and has districts whose people fight, as in Irish tales. In other Mabinogion, however, as in the Taliesin poems and later folk belief, there is an oversea Elysium called Anfin, or Caer Sidi. Its points are ocean streams, and a world beneath the water, a caer or castle of defense under ocean's waves. Its people are skilled in magic and shape-shifting. Mortals desire its spoils, domestic animals, and a marvelous cauldron. It is a deathless land, without sickness. Its waters are like wine, and with it are associated the gods. The Isle of Avalon in Arthurian tradition shows an even closer likeness to the Irish Elysium. Thus, the Irish and Welsh placed Elysium in various regions, local otherworlds, in hills, on Earth's surface, under or over sea, and this doubtless reflects the different environments of the Celtic folk. With neither is it a region of the dead, nor in any sense associated with torment or penance. This is true also of later folk stories of the Green Isle, now seen beneath, now above, the waters. Its people are deathless, skilled in magic. Its waters restore life and health to mortals. Their magic apples grow, and thither mortals are lured or wander by chance. The same conception is still found in the late story told of Dunlang or Hartigan, who fought at Clontarf in 1014 AD. A fairy woman offered him 200 years of life and joy. Life without death, without cold, without thirst, without hunger, without decay, if he would put off combat for a day. But he preferred death in battle to dishonor, and foremost fighting, fell. The parallel between Celtic and early Greek conceptions of Elysium is wonderfully close. Both are open to favored human beings, who are thus made immortal without death. Both are exquisitely beautiful, but sensuous and unmoral. In both are found islands ruled by goddesses who sometimes love mortals. Both are oversea, while a parallel to the said Elysium underground may be found in the later Greek tradition of Elysium as a region of Hades, which may have had roots in an earlier period. The main difference is the occasional Celtic view of Elysium as a place where gods are at war. This may be due to warrior aspects of Celtic life, while the more peaceful conception reflects settled agricultural life, although Norse influences have sometimes been suggested as originating the former. Chapter 10: Mythical Animals and Other Beings. The Celts worshipped animals or their anthropomorphic representations: the horse, swine, stag, bull, serpent, bear, and various birds. There was a horse goddess Epona, a horse god Brodiobus, a mule god Mollo, a swine god Moccus, a bear goddess called Artheo, and Andartha. Dedications to or images of these occurring in France and Britain. Personal names meaning son of the bear or of the dog, etc., suggest myths of animal descent lost to us, though they find a partial illustration in stories like that of Oisin, son of a woman transformed to a fawn. We have seen that gods and magicians assumed animal forms or forced these upon others, and other stories point to the belief that domesticated animals came from the gods' land. From these we turn to tales in which certain animals have a mythic aspect, perhaps connected with the cult of them. A divine bull or swine might readily be regarded as enormously large or strong, or possessed of magic power, or otherwise distinguished. And these are the aspects under which such animals appear in the stories now to be considered. In the Irish tale of Mac Datho's boar, Mac Datho, king of Leinster, had a dog famed throughout the land. It could run around Leinster in a day and was coveted both by Ailill and Medb of Connaught and by Conchobar of Ulster. But Mac Datho promised it to both and invited the monarchs and their retinues to a feast, hoping that he would escape in the quarrel which would certainly arise between them. The chief dish was a boar reared by Mac Datho's grandson Lena, who, though buried in a trench which the boar rooted up over him, succeeded in killing the animal with his sword. For 7 years the boar had been nurtured on the flesh of 50 cows. 60 oxen were required to drag its carcass, and its tail was a load for 60 men. Yet Conall Senrach sucked it entire into his mouth. The story tells nothing more of this remarkable animal, but it may commemorate an old ritual feast upon an animal regarded as divine and endowed with mythic qualities. The Mirabilia added to Nennius' history speak of the Porcus Troit or Tuarc Tuirth, hunted by Arthur, an episode related in the tale of Culhwch and Olwen. This creature, which was a transformed knight, slaughtered many of the hunters before it was overcome, and 3 desirable possessions taken from between its ears. The Porcus Troit resembles the wild boar of Gulban, a transformed child, hunted by Diarmid when the Fane had fled before it. And tradition tells of its great size, 16 feet long. Fionn himself chased a huge boar which terrified everyone until it was slain by his grandson Oscar. It was blue-black, with rough bristles, and no ears or tail. Its teeth protruded horribly, and each flake of foam from its mouth resembled the foam of a mighty waterfall. A closer analogy to Arthur's hunt occurs in the story of the Dindishenchas concerning a pig which wasted the land. Manannan and Maud's hounds pursued it, when it sprang into a lake where it maimed or drowned the following hounds, and then it crossed to Muik Innis, or Pig Island, where it slew Maud with its tusk. Another hunting of magic swine concerns animals from the cave of Kruachan, which is elsewhere associated with divinities. Nothing grew where they went, and they destroyed corn and milk. No one could count them accurately, and when shot at, they disappeared. Medb and Ailil hunted them, and when one of them leaped into Medb's chariot, she seized its leg, but the skin broke, and the pig left it in her hand. After that, no one knew whither they went, although a variant version says that now they were counted. From this cave came other destructive creatures, a great three-headed bird which wasted Erin till Amide again killed it, and red birds which withered everything with their breath until the Ulstermen slew them. It is strange why such animals should be associated with this divine cave, but probably the tradition dates from the time when it was regarded as Ireland's gate of hell, so that any evil spirit might inhabit it. In these stories of divinities or heroes hunting fabulous swine, it is possible that the animals represent some hurtful power, dangerous to vegetation. For the swine is apt to be regarded in a sinister light, and might well be the embodiment of demoniac beings. On the other hand, the animal sacrificed to a god, or of which the god is an anthropomorphic aspect, is sometimes regarded as his enemy, slain by him. Whether this conception lurks behind these tales is uncertain, as also is the question whether the magic immortal swine, the food of the gods, were originally animals sacrificed to them. Divine swine appear in a Fionn tale. The Fain were at a banquet given by Oengus, when the deity said that the best of Fionn's hounds could not kill one of his pigs, but rather his great pig would kill them. Fionn, on the contrary, maintained that his hounds, Bran and Skeolan, could do so. A year after, 101 pigs appeared, one of them coal-black, and each tall as a deer. But the Fain and their dogs killed them all, Bran slaying the black one, whereupon Oengus complained that they had caused the death of his sons and many of the Tuatha De Danann, for they were in the form of the swine. A quarrel ensued, and Fionn prepared to attack Oengus's brug, when the god made peace. In another instance, a fairy as a wild boar eluded the Fain, but Fionn offered the choice of the woman to its slayer, and by the help of a familiar spirit in love with him, Caerwillte got the diabolical beast killed. Fionn covered the women's heads lest Caerwillte should take his wife, but his ruse was unsuccessful. In still another instance, Derbren, Oengus's first love, had 6 foster children, but their mother changed them into swine, and Oengus gave charge of them to Buichet, whose wife desired the flesh of one of them. 100 heroes and as many hounds prepared to hunt them, when they fled to Oengus for help, only to find that he could not give it until they shook the trees of Tarbga and ate the salmon of Inver Umail. Not for a year were they able to do this, but now Med hunted them, and all were slain save one. Other huntings of these swine, less fortunate for the hunters, are also mentioned, and in one passage, Derbren's swine are said to have been fashioned by magic. Both in Irish and in Welsh story, pigs are associated with the god's land, and are brought thence by heroes or by the gods. The Tuatha De Danann are said to have first introduced swine into Ireland or Munster. The mythic bulls of the Tain Boqualgne were reincarnations of divinities, whence enormous strength was theirs, and the brown bull was of vast size. He carried 150 children, until one day he threw them off and killed all but 50. 100 warriors were protected by his shadow from the heat, or by his shelter from the cold. His melodious evening lowing was such as anyone could desire to hear, and no eldritch thing dared approach him. He covered 50 heifers daily, and each next morning had a calf. 2 gifts given to corn by a princess who was with the god Lug were a boar's rib and that of an ox, 24 feet long, forming an arch 8 feet high. But nothing further is told of the animals which owned these huge bones. Cattle were a valued possession of the god's land, and, like swine, were brought thence by heroes. Man easily concluded that animals useful to him were also useful to the gods, but he regarded these as magical. The divine mother of Frauch gave him cows from the Cid, Flidais, one of the tribes of the good folk, was wife of Eilil and the Fair, and had a cow which supplied milk to 300 men at one night's milking. While during the Tain, another account speaks of Flidais having several cows which fed Eilil's army every 7th day. Flidais loved Fergus and urged him to carry her off with her cow, a proof of its value, which is seen also in tales of the capture of cows along with some desirable woman, divine or human. In many Welsh instances, cattle are a possession of the fairy folk dwelling under a lake and often come to land to feed. The cow of Flidais resembles the 7 kine of Manannan's wife. Their milk suffices the people of the entire land of promise, or the men of the whole world, while from the wool of her 7 sheep came all their clothing. Though the waves were the son of Lair's horses in a sea storm, Manannan rode them on his steed Enbar, which he gave to Lug. And this horse was fleet as the naked cold wind of spring, while its rider was never killed off its back. In Elysium, a stud of steeds with grey speckled manes and another crimson brown were seen by Laeg, and similar horses were given to carry mortals back to earth, whence, if they did not dismount, they could return safely to Elysium. Such a steed was brought by Gilla de Caer to Fionn and his men, and miserable looking though it was, when placed among the Fane's horses, it bit and tore them. Conan mounted it in order to ride it to death, but it would not move. And when 13 others vaulted on it, the Gilla fled, followed swiftly by the horse with its riders. Carrying them over land and sea, with another hero holding its tail, it brought them to the land of promise, where Fionn ultimately rescued them. This forms the first part of a late artificial tale, based upon a mythic foundation. Other mythical horses came from a water world. Example, the steeds which Cuchulainn captured, one of these being the Grey of Macha, out of the Grey Lake. Cuchulainn slipped behind it and wrestled with it all round Erin until it was mastered, and when it was wounded at its death, it went into the lake to be healed. The other was Dupsain Glend of the Marvellous Valley, which was captured in similar fashion. Possibly the rushing stream was personified as a steed, and the horse goddess Epona is occasionally connected with streams, while horses which emerge from lakes or rivers may be mythic forms of water divinities. In more recent folk belief, the monstrous water horse of France and Scotland was capable of self-transformation, and waylaid travellers, or resuming human form, he made love to women, luring them to destruction. Did such demoniac horses already exist in the pagan period, or are they a legacy from Scandinavian belief, or are the earlier equine water divinities thus distorted in Christian times? This must remain uncertain, but at all events they were amenable to the power of Christian saints, since Saint Fechin of Four, when one of his chariot horses died on a journey, compelled a water horse to take its place, afterward allowing it to return to the water. Akin to these is the Welsh afanc, one of which was drawn by the oxen of Hu Gardarn from a pond, while another was slain by Peredur, or Percival, after he had obtained a jewel of invisibility which hid him from the monster with its poisoned spear. Mortals as well as Sede were transformed into deer, and fairies possessed herds of those animals, while Coewoltes slew a wild three-antlered stag, the grey one of three antlers, which had long eluded the hunters. Three-horned animals, bull or boar, are depicted on Gaulish monuments, and the third horn symbolizes divinity or divine strength, the word horn being often used as a synonym of might, especially divine power. On an altar discovered at Notre Dame in Paris, the god Cernunnos, the horned, from cernu or horn, has stag's horns, and other unnamed divinities also show traces of antlers. Possibly these gods were anthropomorphic forms of stag divinities, like other Gaulish deities with bull's horns. Serpents or dragons infesting lochs, sometimes generically called paste or baste, Latin bestia or beast, occur in Celtic and other mythologies and are reminiscent of earlier reptile forms, dwelling in watery places and regarded as embodiments of water spirits or guardians of the waters. In later traditions, such monsters were said to have been imprisoned in lochs or destroyed by Celtic saints. As has been seen, a dragon's shriek on May Eve made the land barren, till Lud buried it and its opponent alive after stupefying them with mead. They were placed in a cyst vine at Dinas Emreis in Snowdon, and long afterward Merlin got rid of them when they hindered Vortigern's building operations. Here the dragons are embodiments of powers hostile to man and to fertility, but are conquered by gods, Lud and Merlin. Another story of a paste occurs in the Tan Bo Fraich. Frauch was the most beautiful of Erin's heroes, and his mother was the divine Bebind, her sister the goddess Boan. Findabair, daughter of Aelil and Medb, loved him, but before going to claim her, he was advised to seek from Boan treasure of the Cid, which she gave him in abundance, while he was made welcome at Aelil's dun. After staying there for some time, he desired Findabair to elope with him, only to be refused, whereupon he demanded her of Aelil, but would not give the bride price asked. Aelil and Med therefore plotted his death, fearing that, if he took Findabair by force, the kings who sought her would attack them. While Frauch was swimming in the river, Aelil bid him bring a branch from a rowan tree growing on the bank, and swimming there, he returned with it, Findabair meanwhile admiring the beauty of his body. Aelil sent him for more, but the monster guardian of the tree attacked him, and when he called for a sword, Findabair leaped into the water with it, Aelil throwing a 5-pronged spear at her. Frauch caught it and hurled it back, and though the monster all the while was biting his side, with the sword he cut off its head and brought it to land. A bath of broth was made for him, and afterward he was laid on a bed. Then was heard lamentation, and 150 women of the Cide, clad in crimson with green headdresses, appeared, all of one age, shape, and loveliness, coming for Frauch, the darling of the Cide. They bore him off, bringing him back on the morrow recovered of his wound. And Findabair was now betrothed to Frauch on his promising to assist in the raid of Coalunge. Thus Frauch, a demigod, overcame the pest. In the ballad version from the Dean of Lismore's book, Medb sent him for the berries because he scorned her love. The tree grew on an island in a loch, with the paste coiled round its roots. Every month it bore sweetest fruit, and one berry satisfied hunger for a long time, while its juice prolonged life for a year and healed sickness. Frauch killed the pest, but died of its wounds. The tree was the tree of the gods and resembles the quickened tree of Dubros, guarded by a one-eyed giant whom Diarmaid slew. These stories recall the Greek myth of Heracles slaying the dragon guardian of the apples of the Hesperides, which has a certain parallel in Babylonia. A marvelous tree with jeweled fruit was seen by Gilgamesh in a region on this side of the waters of death, and in the fields of the blessed beyond these waters he found a magic plant, the twigs of which renewed man's youth. He gathered it, but a serpent seized it and carried it off. The stories of Frauch and Diarmaid point to myths showing that gods were jealous of men sharing their divine food, and their tree of life was guarded against mortals, though perhaps semi-divine heroes might gain access to it and obtain its benefits for human beings. The guardian paste recalls the dragons entwined round oaks in the grove described by Lucan. Such Celtic pastes were slain by Fionn, and in one poem, Fionn, or in another, his son Dair, was swallowed by the monster, but hacked his way out, liberating others besides himself. They also defended dunes in Celtic story, and in the sequel to the tale of Frauch, he and Conall reached a dune where his stolen cattle were. A serpent sprang into Conall's belt, but was later released by him, and neither did harm to the other. In Cuchulainn's account of his journey to Scath, the dune had 7 walls, each with an iron palisade, and having destroyed these, he reached the pit guarded by serpents, which he slew with his fists, as well as many toads, sharp and beaked beasts, and ugly dragon-like monsters. Then he took a cauldron and cows from the dune, which must have been in the gods' land across the sea, as in other tales where such thefts are related. A curious story from the Dinchsenchas tells how the son of the Morrigan had 3 hearts with shapes of serpents through them, or with the shape of serpents' heads. He was slain by Macshecht, and if death had not befallen him, these serpents would have grown and destroyed all other animals. The hearts were burned, and the ashes were cast into a stream, whereupon its rapid stayed, and all creatures in it died. In another story, Cian was born with a caul which increased with his growth, but Scathan ripped it open, and a worm sprang from it, which was thought to have the same span of life as Cian. A wood was put round it, and the creature was fed, but it grew to a vast size and swallowed men whole. Fire was set to the wood, when it fled to a cave and made a wilderness all around. But at last Oisin killed it with Diarmaid's magic spear. Serpents with rams' heads are a frequent motif on Gaulish monuments, either separately or as the adjuncts of a god, but their meaning is unknown, and no myth regarding them has survived. Other parts of nature besides animals were regarded mythically. Mountains, the sea, rivers, wells, lakes, sun, moon, and earth had a personality of their own, and this conception survived when other ideas had risen. Appeal was made to them, as the runes sung by Morrigan and Amirgan show, and they were taken as sureties, or their power was invoked to do harm, as when Eidruad's champion took sureties of sea, wind, sun, and firmament against him, so that the sun's heat caused aid to bathe, and the rising sea and a great wind drowned him. In another instance, a spell chanted over the sea by Dub, wife of Enna of the Sidde, caused the drowning of his other wife, Ade, and her family. The personality of the sea is seen also in the story of Lindgadan and the echo heard at a cliff. Enraged at someone speaking to him without being asked, he turned the cliff to be avenged upon the speaker, when the crest of a wave dashed him against a rock. So too, the sea was obedient to man, or perhaps to a god. Tuirbet Ragmar, father of the Goban Sair, used to hurl his axe from the hill of the axe in the full of the flood tide, forbidding the sea to come beyond the axe, an action akin to the Celtic ritual of fighting the waves. The voices of the waves had a warning, prophetic, or sympathetic sound to those who could hear them right, as many instances show. As elsewhere, personalized parts of nature came to be regarded as animated by spirits, like man, and such spirits gradually became more or less detached from these and might be seen as divine beings appearing near them. Some of them became the greater gods, while others assumed a darker character, perhaps because they were associated with sinister aspects of nature or with the dead. The Celts knew all these, and some still linger on in folk belief. Fairy-like or semi-divine women seen by streams or fountains, or in forests, or living in lakes or rivers, are survivals of spirits and goddesses of river, lake, or earth. And they abound in Celtic folk story as bonnes dames, dames blanches, fays, or the Irish bay find. Beings like mermaids existed in early Irish belief. When Ruad's ships were stopped, he went over the side and saw the loveliest of the world's women, 3 of them detaining each boat. They carried him off, and he slept with each in turn, one becoming with child by him. They set out in a bronze boat to intercept him on his return journey. But when they failed, the mother killed his child and hurled the head after him, the others crying, "It is an awful crime." In another tale, Wrath heard the mermaid's song and saw them, grown-up girls, the fairest of shape and make, with yellow hair and white skins above the waters. But huger than one of the hills was the hairy-clawed, bestial lower part which they had beneath. Their song lulled him to sleep, when they flocked round him and tore him limb from limb. Other sea-dwellers are the Luchorpain, a kind of dwarf, 3 of whom were caught by Fergus and forced to comply with his wish and to tell him how to pass under lochs and seas. They put herbs in his ears, or one of them gave him a cloak to cover his head, and thus he went with them under the water. A curious group of beings answered Cuchulainn's cry, causing confusion to his enemies, or screamed around him when he set out or was in the thick of the fight. While he fought with Ferdia, around him shrieked the Bocanachs and the Bonanachs, and the Geniti Glynne, and the demons of the air. For it was the custom of the Tuatha De Danann to raise their cries about him in every battle, and thus increase men's fear of him. Or they screamed from the rims of shields and hilts of swords and hafts of spears of the hero and of Ferdia. Here they are friendly to Cuchulainn, but in the fled Brickrend, or feast of Bricriu, one of the tasks imposed on him, Conall, and Ligoer, was to fight the Geniti Glynne, Cuchulainn alone succeeding and slaughtering many of them. What kind of beings they were is uncertain, but the Geniti Glynne means damsels of the glen. Perhaps they were a kind of nature spirits, this being also suggested by the demons of the air, which were expelled by Saint Patrick. As nature spirits, they might be classed with the Tuatha De Danann, as indeed they seem to be in the passage cited above. In one sentence of the Tain Bo Kualange, they are associated with Nemain or Badb, who brought confusion upon Med's host. Yet, on the other hand, they dared not appear in the same district as the bull of Kualange. Chapter 11. Myths of Origins. Savage and barbaric peoples possess many grotesque myths of the origin of various parts of nature. In recently existing Celtic folklore, and in stories preserved mainly in the Dinsenchas, conceptions not unlike these are found and doubtless were handed down from the pre-Christian period, whether Celtic or pre-Celtic, while in certain instances a saint takes the place of an older pagan personage. In Brittany and elsewhere in France, natural features, rivers, lakes, hills, rocks, are associated in their origin with giants, fairies, witches, or the devil, just as in other Celtic regions, and indeed in all parts of the world. Many traditions, however, connect them with the giant Gargantua, who was not a creation of Rabelais's brain, but was borrowed from popular belief. He may have been an old Celtic god or hero, popular and therefore easily surviving in folk memory, and may also be the Gargantuus, son of Belinus, king of Britain, mentioned by Giraldus Cambrensis. Many hills or isolated rocks or erratic boulders are described as his teeth, or as stones thrown, or vomited, or ejected by him. And rivers or lakes were formed from his blood or urine, numerous traditions regarding these being collected by Sebilot in his book on Gargantua. In Irish stories, similar traditions are found and are of a naive character. Manannan shed 3 drops of grief for his dead son, and these became 3 locks. As in the Finnish Kalevala, a mother's tears are changed into rivers. Again, a king's daughter died of shame when her lover saw her bathing, and her foster mother's tears made Loch Gill. In other instances, lochs are formed by water pouring forth at the digging of a grave. Example, that of Manannan, slain in battle, or that of Garman, son of Glass. Or a well is the source of a loch because someone was drowned in it, or because its waters poured forth over intruders, or because of the breaking of a taboo connected with it. Example, leaving its cover off. In 2 instances already cited, the urine of a horse belonging to a god produced a loch. And more curious still is the myth of the woman Odras, whom the Morrigan changed into a pool of water. An interesting story tells of the magic creation of a wood. Gaible, son of Nuada, stole a bundle of twigs which Ainge, daughter of Dagda, had gathered to make a tub. For Dagda had made one which dripped during flood tide, and she wished for a better one. Gaible threw away the bundle, and it became a wood springing up in every direction. This is of a very primitive character, and resembles the folk tale incident of the transformation flight, in which a twig, comb, or reed thrown down by fugitives become a thick forest or bush impeding the pursuers. Curious too is the story of Caudal, who on a hillock fed his fosterling Eriu, from whom is named Eriu's Island, or Island. As she grew, the hillock increased with her, and had she not complained to Caudal of the sun's heat and the cold wind, it would have grown until Ireland was filled with the mountain. Another story, recalling that of the Australian Bunjils slicing earth with a knife into creeks and valleys, tells how Fergus, with Cuchulain's sword, the coloured bog out of the Sid, sheared the tops of 3 mountains, which are now Meath's 3 bare ones, while as a counter blow Cuchulain did the same to 3 hills in Athlone. In another tale, Fergus, irritated against Conchobar, struck 3 blows on the ground and thus caused 3 hills to raise, which will endure forever. The first occurrence of other things is often the subject of a tradition. Many myths exist about the origin of fire, and in Irish story, the first campfire was made by Eadne for the Milesians by wringing his hands together, when flashes as large as apples came from his knuckles, this resembling the legends of light or fire obtained from a saint's hand. At Nimnach, near the Sid of Tara, rose a stream on which stood the first mill built in Ireland, but no myth describes its origin. On the other hand, the story of the first trap resembles that told of the guillotine and its inventor. Coba was trapper to Erim, son of Mille, and was the first to prepare a trap and pitfall in Erin. But having put his leg into it to test it, his shin bone and arms were fractured, and he died. Bria, in the time of Partholan, was the first man to build a house or make a cauldron, that important vessel of Celtic myth and ritual, while the first smelting of gold was the work of Tigern Mas, a mythic Irish king. The divine origin of ploughing with oxen has already been mentioned, an interesting agricultural myth. Bridget, goddess of poetry, when her son Ruadan died at Macturid, bewailed him with the first keening heard in Ireland, and she also invented a whistle for night signalling. So also the first satire, with dire effects, was spoken by Corpre, poet of the gods. Another instrument, the harp, was discovered accidentally. All was discord in the time of the Firbolgs. Canola fled from her husband, and by the shore heard a sweet murmur as the wind played through the sinews till clinging to a whale's skeleton. Listening, she fell asleep, and when her husband, finding her thus, learned that the sound had lulled her, he made a framework of wood for the sinews. On this he played, and the pair were reconciled. But the Irish could also look back to a golden age, when, in the reign of Gede the loud-voiced, each one deemed the other's voice as sweet as strings of lutes would be, because of the greatness of the peace and friendship which everyone had for the other. And, with the addition of plenty and prosperity, much the same is said of Conair's reign, until Midir's vengeance overtook him. Prosperity was supposed to characterize every good king's reign in Ireland, perhaps pointing to earlier belief in his divinity and the dependence of fertility on him. But the result is precisely that which everywhere marked the Golden Age. As elsewhere too, gods instituted festivals, one myth telling how Lugh first celebrated that of Lugnasad, not in his own honour, but to the glory of his foster mother. The mythic trees of Elysium were not unknown on earth, though there they were safely guarded. And another instance, besides those already described, is found in the oak of Mugna. Berries to berries the strong upholder put upon it, 3 fruits upon it, that is, acorn, apple, and nut. And when the first fruit fell, another used to grow. Leaves were always on this useful tree, which stood still until Ninain the poet cast it down. What is perhaps a debased myth of a world tree like Yggdrasil is found in the story of the tree in Loch Gwyr, seen once every 7 years as the loch dried when its enchantment left it. A green cloth covered the tree, and a woman sat knitting under it. But once a man stole the cloth, whereupon the woman said, "Awake, thou silent tide! From the dead woman's land a horseman rides, from my head the green cloth snatching." At these words the waters pursued him and took half of his horse and the cloth from him. Few and fragmentary as these myths are, they, with the classical myths already cited, prove what a rich cosmogony the ancient Celts must have had. Chapter 12. The Heroic Myths. 1. Cuchulainn and his Circle. The Celts possessed many myths regarding ideal heroic figures or actual heroes who tended to become mythical. A kind of saga was formed about some of these, telling of their birth, their deeds, their amours, their procuring for men spoils from the gods' land, and their death or departure to Elysium. While round them were ranged other personages whose deeds are also recounted, and who may have been the subjects of separate sagas. Groups of tribes had each their hero, who occasionally attained wider popularity and was adopted by other tribes. To these heroes are ascribed magic and supernatural deeds. Some of them are of divine origin, sons of gods or reincarnations of gods, and they differ in many respects from ordinary men, in size or appearance or in power. In a sense, they are divine and may have been at one time subjects of cult, but in the myths they are represented as living and moving on earth, and to some of them a definite date is given. The three heroes best known, each the center of a group, are Cuchulainn, Fionn, and Arthur. The stories concerning Cuchulainn, who was more prominent than his king Conchobar, were current among the tribes of Ulster. Those about Fionn were popular first in Leinster and Munster, then over all Ireland and the West Highlands. Those about Arthur were found among the Britons. Cuchulainn is the chief figure about the court of Conchobar, alleged to have been king of Ulster at the beginning of the Christian era. The heroes were champions of the Red Branch, so called after a room in Conchobar's palace of Emain Macha. And three are more prominent and on some occasions rivals: Cuchulainn, Conall the Victorious, and Loigeir the Triumphant. Others of the group are Dectire, Conchobar's sister, their father Cathbad the Druid, Fergus mac Roich, Ferdia, Curoi mac Daire, and Bricriu, while Ailil and Meb of Connaught also enter into the saga. The stories about these are over 100 in number, but reference can here be made only to those in which Cuchulainn figures prominently. Some of the group are descended from the Tuatha De Danann, or their origin is supernatural. One story makes Conchobar a natural son of Nessa by Cathbad. Later King Fergus mac Roich wished to marry her, and she agreed, if he would resign the throne for a year to Conchobar. But when the year passed, Fergus was deposed, and the youth remained king with many privileges. He had the jus primae noctis over every girl in the province, and in whatever house he stayed, the wife was at his disposal. Yet he was wisest of men, possessed of many gifts, and a great hero. In another story, Nessa was sent for water by Cathbad, and brought it from the river Conchobar, whereupon Cathbad forced her to drink it, because it contained 2 worms. She became pregnant after swallowing these, and at birth her child held a worm in each hand, and was named after the river. Some, however, regarded him as son of Nessa's lover, Factna Fatach, king of Ulster. Thus, 3 origins are ascribed to Conchobar: son of Cathbad, Od of Factna, or of a river personalized, or of a river god who took the form of the worms. A similar origin is ascribed to Conall. His mother, Finn Choim, Cathbad's daughter, being bidden by a druid to wash in and drink from a well over which he sang spells, swallowed a worm and became Enceinte, the worm lying in the child's hand in her womb. Cuchulainn was son of the god Lugh, and though he was also called son of Sualtam, Dectiri's husband, yet even here his origin is semi-divine. Sualtam's mother was of the Sid folk. He was called Sualtam Sidech, of the fairy haunts, and possessed the magic might of an elf. The supernatural aspect of some of the personages is seen in Cuchulainn's feats or his distortion, or in Fergus, who had the strength of 700 men, ate 7 hogs and kine at a meal, and wielded a sword as long as a rainbow, while a 7th part of him surpassed the whole day of any ordinary man. In one passage, Conchobar is called Dia Talmaide, or a terrestrial god, while Dectire is termed a goddess. Yet Cuchulainn was not necessarily a sun god or sun hero, for if he was, why does the Táin, in which he plays so great a part, take place in winter, while his greatest activity is from Samhain or November until the beginning of spring? Nor is every mistress of his a dawn goddess, nor every foe a power of darkness. The boyish deeds of Cuchulainn were described to Medb during the Táin by Fergus and others. Before his 5th year, when already possessed of man's strength, he heard of the boy corpse of his uncle Conchobar and went to test them, taking his club, ball, spear, and javelin, playing with these as he went. At Emain he joined the boys at play without permission, but this was an insult, and they set upon him, throwing at him clubs, spears, and balls, all of which he fended off, besides knocking down 50 of the boys, while his contortion seized him. The first reference to this curious phenomenon. Conchobar now interfered, but Cuchulainn would not desist until all the boys came under his protection and guarantee. At Conchobar's court he performed extraordinary feats and expelled a band of invaders when the Ulstermen were in their yearly weakness. He was first known as Setanta, and was called Cuchulainn in the following way. Culann the smith had prepared a banquet for Conchobar, who, on his way to it, saw the youth holding the field at bowl against 350 others, and though he bade him follow, Setanta refused to come until the play was over. While the banquet was progressing, Culann let loose his great watchdog, which had the strength of 100, and when Setanta reached the fort, the beast attacked him, whereupon he thrust his ball into its mouth, and seizing its hind legs, battered it against a rock. Culann complained that the safeguard of his flocks and herds were destroyed, but the boy said that he would act as watchdog until a whelp of its breed was ready. And Cathbad the druid now gave him a name, Cuchulainn, or Culann's dog. This adventure took place before he was 7 years old. Bowdis suggests that as Cuchulainn was not the hero's birth name, a dog may have been his manito, his name being given him in some ceremonial way at puberty, a circumstance afterward explained by the mythical story of Culann's hound. One day Cuchulainn overheard Cathbad saying that whatever stripling assumes arms on that day would have a short life, but would be the greatest of warriors. He now demanded arms from Conchobar, but broke every set of weapons given him until he received Conchobar's own sword and shield. And he also destroyed 17 chariots, so that nothing but Conchobar's own chariot sufficed him. Cuchulainn made the charioteer drive fast and far until they reached the dun of the sons of Nechtan, each of whom he fought and slew, cutting off their heads. While on his return he killed 2 huge stags and then captured 24 wild swans, fastening all these to the chariot. From afar, Levarcham the prophetess saw the strange cavalcade approaching amain, and bade all be on their guard, else the warrior would slay them. But Conchobar alone knew who he was, and recognized the danger from a youth whose appetite for slaughter had been whetted. A stratagem was adopted, based upon Cuchulainn's well-known modesty. 150 women with uncovered breasts were sent to meet him, and while he averted his face, he was seized and plunged into vessels of cold water. The first burst asunder. The water of the second boiled with the heat from his body. That of the third became warm, and thus his rage was calmed. Fiacha, who tells this story, now describes the hero. Besides being very handsome, with golden tresses, he had 7 toes on each foot, 7 fingers on each hand, and 7 pupils in each eye, while on his body was a shirt of gold thread and a green mantle with silver clasps. No wonder, added Fiacha, that now at 17 he is slaughtering so many in the Tain Bok Walange. Cuchulainn's beauty attracted women, whence Conchobar's warriors, fearing for the virtue of their wives, sent him to woo Forgal's daughter, Emer. But to hinder this, Forgal urged him to find Domnall the warlike in Alba, hoping that he would never return. He set off with Conchobar, Loigeir, and Conall, and after Domnall had caught them extraordinary feats, he sent them to receive instruction from Scathach, who dwelt to the east of Alba. Meanwhile, Cuchulainn had refused the love of Domnall's ugly daughter, Dornolla. She vowed vengeance, and when the heroes departed, she caused a vision of Emain to rise before Cuchulainn's companions, which made them so homesick that he had to proceed alone. Instructed by a youth, he crossed the plain of ill luck safely. On its first half, men's feet struck fast, and on the second half, the grass held their feet on the points of its blades. But he must first follow the track of a wheel, and then that of an apple, which rolled before him. A narrow path through a glen would bring him to Scathach's house, which was on an island approached by a narrow bridge, slippery as an eel's tail, or, in another version, high in the centre, while the other end rose up whenever anyone leaped on it, and flung him backward. This island and bridge are not mentioned in the older recensions of the story. After many attempts, Cuchulainn reached the other side by his salmon leap. Uathach, Scathach's daughter, fell in love with him, and told him how to obtain valor from her mother. He must make his salmon leap to the great yew tree where Scathach was teaching her sons, Cuare and Ket, and set his sword between her breasts. Thus he obtained from Scathach all his wishes: acquaintance with her feats, marriage to Uathach without a dowry, and knowledge of his future, while she yielded herself to him. For a year he remained with Scathach, learning skill in arms, and then, despite her attempts to hinder him, he assisted her in fighting the Amazon Aife and her warriors. Having discovered that Aife loved above all else her charioteer and chariot horses, he exclaimed, as he fought her, that these had perished. She looked aside, and that moment Cuchulainn overcame her and made her promise never again to oppose Scathach. From his amour with Aife, a son would be born called Conlauk, who was to wear a ring which Cuchulainn left for him, and to seek his father when he was a warrior of 7 years old. He must make himself known to none, turn aside for none, and refused combat to none. On his return to Scathach, Cuchulainn slew a hag who disputed the crossing of the bridge of leaps, and Scathach bound him, and Ferdiad, Frauch, Nicey, and Fergus, whom she had trained, never to combat with each other. While going home to Ireland, he slew the Fomorians, to whom Devorgilla, daughter of the king of the Isles, was to be given in tribute, an early Celtic version of the story of Perseus and Andromeda. Though Devorgilla was awarded to Cuchulainn, he afterward gave her to Loghaid as wife, since he himself was to marry Emer. Whereupon Devorgilla and her handmaid sought the hero in the form of birds, and when he wounded them, their true form appeared. Cuchulainn sucked out the sling stone, and with it some blood. And for this reason also he could not wed her, for he had drunk her blood, a mythical version of the rite of blood brotherhood. He now carried off Emer despite Forgal's opposition, and she became his wife, though not before Conchobar exercised his royal prerogative on her. The feats which Cuchulainn learned from Scathach are no longer intelligible and are probably exaggerated or imaginary warrior exploits. Scathach and Ife may be reminiscences of actual Celtic female warriors, though the hero's visit to Scathach's isle is akin to his journey to Fand. It is a visit to a divine land, whose people are sometimes at war, as in the stories of Fand and Leogair, but where wisdom, valor, and other things may be gained by mortals. When Conlau came to Ireland, his father's injunctions were the cause of his slaying his own son in ignorance with his marvellous fear, the Guy Bolga. And when he recognized the ring which his son wore, great was his sorrow. This is a Celtic version of the story of Sohrab and Rustam. Cuchulainn did not at once become hero of Ulster. In the story of Macdatho's boar, to which reference has already been made, the hero is Conall, who never passed a day without killing a Connaught man or slept without a Connaught man's head under his knee. Bricriu, the provoker of strife, advised that each man should get a share of the boar according to his warlike deeds. Set of Connaught was chief until Conall arrived and put him to shame, and then, through the boar's tail required 50 men to carry it, he sucked it into his mouth, allotting scanty portions to the men of Connaught. In the fight which ensued, the latter were routed, Macdatho's hound siding with the Ulstermen. The Fled Brickrend, or Feast of Bricriu, tells of a feast made for Conchobar and his men by Bricriu in a fast house built for this purpose. Bricriu prepared for himself a balcony with a window looking down on the hall, for he knew that the Ulstermen would not allow him to enter it. Yet they feared to accept the invitation, lest he should provoke quarrels among them, and the dead should outnumber the living. Thereupon he asserted that if they refused, he would do still worse. And after discussion it was agreed that they should go, but that Bricriu should be guarded from entering the feast. In the sequel, however, he provoked a quarrel between Leogair, Conall, and Cuchulainn as to which of them should receive the champion's potion, whereupon each claimed it, and a fight arose between them in the hall. This reflects actual Celtic custom, for Poseidonius speaks of festivals at which a quarter of pork was taken by the bravest, and if another claimed it, they fought until one was killed. Conchobar separated the heroes, and censure announced that the question should be submitted to Ailill, king of Connaught. Meanwhile, Bricriu stirred up strife among the heroes' wives, who had left the hall, by telling each in turn that she should have the right of first entry, and this caused a quarrel among them, everyone extolling her own husband. Loigeir and Conall each made a breach in the wall so that his wife should enter first, the door having been closed. But Cuchulainn removed one side of the house, and his wife Emer had precedence. Bricrew then demanded that the damage should be repaired, but none could do this save Cuchulainn, and he only after extraordinary exertions. Conchobar now bade the heroes go to Curoi Mac Daire, whose judgments were always equitable, in order that he might settle the question. On his way, Loigeir encountered a repulsive giant with a cudgel, who beat him and made him return without horses, chariot, or charioteer. And Conall made the same fate, Cuchulainn alone being able to overcome the giant and to return in triumph with arms and horses. Bricrew thereupon announced that the champion's morsel was Cuchulainn's, but his rivals objected, saying that one of his friends of the Sidhe had overcome them. The Ulstermen now sought judgment from Ailill, but Cuchulainn remained behind to amuse the women with his feats, until Loeg, his charioteer, reproached him with delay. By the swiftness of their chariot horses, they arrived first at Ailill's palace, where water was brought by 150 young girls to provide baths for the heroes, and the most beautiful of these accompanied them to their couches. Cuchulainn choosing Findbair, Ailill's daughter. Ailill asked 3 days and nights to consider the question, and on the first night 3 cats, druidic beasts from the cave of Cruachan, arrived. Conall and Loigeir abandoned their food to them, but Cuchulainn attacked them, and at dawn the cats disappeared, after the manner of other supernatural beings, who vanish at daybreak. Ailill was in despair how to solve the problem of the championship, but Med sneered at him, and sending for each hero, gave him a cup without the others knowing it, saying that it would assure him of the champion's morsel at Conchobar's board. Meanwhile, Cuchulainn vanquished the others in the sport of wheel throwing, while he also threw needles so that each one entered the eye of the other, forming a single line. But now sent them to Ercol and Garmna to seek their judgment, and they referred them to Samera, who dispatched them to the Genti Gilni. Loigeir and Conall returned without arms or garments. Cuchulainn was at first overcome, but when Loig reproached him, his demoniac fury began, and he attacked them and filled the valley with their blood, taking their banner and going back as a conqueror to Samera, who said that he should have the champion's morsel. Returning to Ercol, the warriors were challenged to combat him and his horse. Loigeir's steed was killed by Ercol's, and he fled to Emain, saying that the others were slain by Ercol. Conall also fled, but Cuchulainn's horse, the Grey of Macha, killed Ercol's, and he then carried Ercol prisoner to Emain, where he found everyone lamenting his death. On the way, Samera's daughter Buan, who had fallen in love with Cuchulainn, leaped after his chariot, and falling on a rock, was killed. A feast was prepared at Emain Macha, and now each hero produced his cup in expectation of the award. Cuchulainn's cup, however, of gold and precious stones, proved the most valuable and beautiful, and all would have given him the championship, had not his rivals maintained that this was not a true judgment, and threatened to attack the hero. Conchobar therefore sent them to Yellow, son of Fair, who bade them to go to Terran, son of Great Fear, a giant who could assume whatever form pleased him. He proposed the covenant of the axe, which Loigeir and Conall refused, whereas Cuchulainn accepted it, provided they would acknowledge his supremacy, the covenant being that Cuchulainn should cut off Terror's head today, while Terror cut off his tomorrow. When Cuchulainn did his part, Terror took his head and axe and plunged into his loch. But next day he appeared, and Cuchulainn placed himself in position. 3 times Terror drew the axe over his neck, and then bade him rise in token of his bravery. But still his rivals would not give way, so that now the Ulstermen bade them seek the judgment of Curoi. This axe game is found in Arthurian romance, in the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and it is apparently based on an actual Celtic custom of a man, in token of bravery, after an entertainment, allowing someone to cut his throat with a sword. At Curoi's castle, Blathnat, his wife, welcomed them in his absence, though he knew they would come, and she bade them take turns in guarding it. In whatever part of the world Curoi was, he sang a spell over the castle at night, and it revolved as swiftly as a millstone, so that the entrance could not be found, an incident found elsewhere in Celtic romance. Loegr took the first watch and saw a giant approaching from the sea, as high as heaven and bearing oak trees in his hands, which he threw at Loegr, missing him each time, after which the monster stretched out his hand, and squeezing him till he was half dead, threw him outside the castle. Next night Conall met the same fate. On the night when Cuchulainn watched, the 3 goblins of Seskind Uarboil, the 3 herdsmen of Bragia, and the 3 sons of Brigfist, the siren, were to unite to take the castle, while the spirit of the lake nearby would swallow it whole. But Cuchulainn slew the 9 foes when they arrived, as well as 2 others bands of 9, making a cairn of their heads and arms. Wearied and sad, he now heard the loch roaring like the sea, and saw a monster emerging from it and approaching with open jaws to gulp the castle down. With one leap he came behind it, tore out its heart, and cutting off its head, placed it on the heap. At dawn the giant arrived, and when he stretched out his hand, Cuchulainn made his salmon leap and whirled his sword round his head, whereupon the monster vanished after having agreed to grant his 3 wishes: the sovereignty of Ireland's heroes, the champion's morsel, and precedence for Emer over the women of Ulster. Cuchulainn's sleep had brought him outside the castle, but after several trials he sprang back into it with a sigh, and Blathnat said, "That is a sigh of victory." When Curoi arrived, he found the trophies outside his castle, and gave judgment in Cuchulainn's favour. Later, when all 3 were absent from Emain Macha, a huge boar arrived, carrying a tree, a vast beam, and an axe with a handle which required a plough team to move it. He announced that he had sought everywhere for a man capable of fighting him, and proposed the covenant of the axe. This passage repeats grotesquely the former incident, save that Fatneck, who struck off the boar's head, refused to fulfill his part of the covenant, as also did Loegr and Conall on their return. Cuchulainn took his place, but the boar spared him, calling him the bravest of warriors and fulfilling for him the 3 wishes he had made, for he was none other than Curoi, who had taken first the giant's, then the boar's form. The story of the exile of the sons of Doel the Forgotten opens with a version of Bricriu's feast. Cuchulainn had been cursed by Eoco Rond to have no rest until he discovered why Doel's sons left their country. With Loig and Lugaid, he captured the ship of the king of Alba's son, who gave him a charm, and thus they reached an island with a rampart of silver and a palisade of bronze, while on it was a castle where dwelt a royal pair, Riangabeir and Finnabeir, with 3 beautiful daughters. These welcomed them, because Loig was their son, and Rianga Baird told Cuchulainn that the sister of Dúil's sons and her husband were in the southern isle. In the morning Cuchulainn gave a ring to Itan, one of the daughters, who had slept with him, and then sailed for the isle. Conla, husband of Acthland, Dúil's daughter, had his head against a stone in the west of the isle, and his fleet against another in the east, a position resembling that in which Nut is represented above the earth in Egyptian mythology. Acthland was combing his hair. As the ship approached, Conla blew so violently that a wave was formed, but as no diviner had announced danger from Cuchulainn, he was allowed to land. Acthland made him a sign and then said that she knew where her brothers were and that she would go with him, for it was foretold that he would rescue them. They reached an island where two women were cutting rushes, and one of them sang of 7 kings who ruled it. Cuchulainn brained her, whereupon the other told him the names of the kings, one of whom was Coirpre, Dúil's brother. Coirpre attacked Cuchulainn, but was forced to sue for mercy and carried him into the castle, where he gave him his daughter and told him the story of Dúil's sons. Next day, Eoco Glas arrived to fight Coirpre, and Cuchulainn leaped on the edge of his shield, but Eoco blew him into the sea. Now he leaped on the boss of the shield, again on Eoco himself, and both times he was blown into the ocean. But at last he slew his foe with the Gai Bolga. Then came the Sidhe, whom Eoco had outraged, among them Dúil's sons, and battled in his blood to wash away the shame. Cuchulainn returned to Ringan Baird's isle, where he slept with Finnabair, and finally reaching Emain Macha, he went thence to Ailil and Meb, who caused Eocha Ron to be brought. He had fought Cuchulainn because his daughter Findochaim loved him, and on her account had put Gyasa or spells on the hero, who now, having fulfilled them, demanded and obtained her. Both these tales contain many primitive traits and mythical incidents which throw considerable light on earlier Celtic folk belief. Previous to Bricriu's feast must be placed a story in which Curoi discomfited Cuchulainn. He joined the hero and others in attacking the stronghold of the god Midir in the Isle of Falga, or the Land of Promise, and led them into it when their efforts failed through the magic of its defenders, his condition being that he must have whatever jewel he chose. The invaders carried off Midir's 3 cows, his cauldron, and his daughter Blathnat. To Cuchulainn's chagrin, however, Curoi chose her and took her away by magic. And though the hero pursued him, he was bound hand and foot by Curoi and shaved with his sword. Another version of this exploit, or perhaps of an analogous feat, tells how Cuchulainn journeyed to Scath, and by aid of the king's daughter stole a cauldron, 3 cows, and much gold. But his coracle was wrecked, and he had to swim home with his men clinging to him. When Cuchulainn went to obtain Curoi's judgment, he may have come to an arrangement with Blathnat, for Keating says that, finding him alone, she told him that she loved him, while a story in the Din Senchas describes her as his paramour and declares that she bade him come and take his revenge. She brought it about that Curoi was alone in his castle, and as a signal she caused milk to flow downstream to Cuchulainn, whereupon he entered and slew Curoi, whose sword Blathnat had taken. In another version, however, the incident of the separable soul occurs. Curoi's soul was in an apple, and this in a salmon, which appeared every 7 years in a certain well, while the apple could be split only by Curoi's sword. This knowledge was obtained by Curoi's wife, as in parallel stories, and the sword given by her to Cuchulainn, who thus compassed her husband's death. The folk tale formula is thus complete, though doubtless Curoi is a genuine Celtic personality, whose fame was known to Welsh bards. Probably a complete saga existed about this great hero or divinity and magician, who, according to another story, with his magic wand took possession of Ireland and the great world. The slaying of Curoi should be compared with that of Leo, brought about by Blodeuwed's treachery, and with the killing of Sirbhan by his own club, especially as Blodeuwed's name, meaning flower face, from Blodeu or flowers, is akin to blatnuts, which is probably from blath or bloom. In the sequel, Curoi's poet avenged his death by leaping off a cliff with blathnut in his arms. The greatest adventure in Cuchulainn's career occurs in the Tyne Bo Cualange, or Cattle Raid of Cualange, to which belong a number of prefatory tales, some of them already cited. Only the briefest account of this long story can be given here. Queen Medb of Connaught desired the dawn or brown bull of Cualange in Ulster, so that she might have the equivalent of a husband Ailill's bull, the Find Benach, or white-horned, these bulls, as narrated above, being rebirths of semi-divinities. When Daire, owner of the bull, refused to give it, Med collected an enormous force to march against Ulster at the time when the Ulstermen were in their debility, the result of Macha's curse. Cuchulainn and Sualtam were unaffected by that curse, however, and they went against the host, in which were some heroes of Ulster, Cormac, Conall, Fiacha, and Fergus, exiled because of a quarrel with Conchobar for his treacherous murder of the sons of Usnech. As Medb set out, a beautiful girl suddenly appeared on her chariot shaft, announcing herself as servant of Medb's people, Fedalm the prophetess, or Bunfide, from the Cid of Cruachan. Hence, Medb was also of the Cide. But she prophesied disaster because of Cuchulainn, whom she saw in a vision. Cuchulainn, having entered the forest, stood on one leg, and using one hand and one eye, he cut down an oak sapling, which he twisted into a ring, inscribing on it his name, and placing it over a pillar stone. This was a gaze or a taboo to the host, to not advance until they had done the same. And meanwhile, he kept tryst with Conchobar's daughter Fedalm, or with her handmaid. Again entering a wood, he cut down the fork of a tree, placed on it 4 heads of the enemy slain by him, and set it in a ford to prevent the chariots from passing until it was drawn out. Now he slew hundreds of the host, but a treaty was made that every day a warrior should meet him in single combat, while he allowed the army to proceed. These combats, described with great spirit, as well as other daring deeds of Cuchulainn's, occupied a greater part of the time. But none of them is so full of interest and pathos as the long episode of the fight with Ferdia, his former fellow pupil, with Scathach, whom at last, to his morrow, he slew. One incident tells of the warning given by the goddess Morrigan, in the form of a bird, to the bull to be aware of Medb's men, so that, with 50 heifers, he fled to the heifers' glen, but was ultimately taken and brought to Medb's host. And another passage describes Cuchulainn's rejection of Morrigan's advances, and her wounding and later healing by him. There is also the incident of Medb's sending her women to bid him smear a false beard on himself when her warrior Loch refused to fight this beardless youth, whereupon he set a spell over some grass and clapped it to his chin, so that all thought he had a beard. To help given to Cuchulainn by Lug has already been described, and the Tuatha De Danann likewise aided him by throwing healing herbs and plants into the streams in which his wounds were washed. Interesting is the long account of his riastrad, or distortion, before wreaking his fury on the men of Connaught for slaying the boy corpse of Emain. He grew to an immense size and quivered in every limb, while his feet, shins, and knees were reversed in his body. This was the permanent condition of Livarcham and Dornola, already mentioned, and implied swiftness and strength, since Livarcham traversed all Ireland every day. Of Cuchulain's eyes, one sank in his head so that a heron could not have reached it, while the other protruded from its socket as large as the rim of a cauldron. His mouth reached his ears, and fire streamed from it, mounting above his head in showers, while a great jet of blood, higher and more rigid than a ship's mast, shot upward from his scalp, within which his hair retreated, and formed a mist all about. This distortion frequently came upon Cuchulain, like the terrific heat sometimes given off by his body, enough to melt deep snow for 30 feet around. During the progress of the Tyne, Ailill sent messengers to Cuchulain, offering him his daughter Findabair if he would keep away from the host. Finally his fool, taking Ailill's shape, approached the hero with Findabair, but Cuchulain detected the transformation and slew him, besides thrusting a stone through Findabair's mantle and tunic. She had been offered to Ferdia and others if they conquered Cuchulain, but later she died of shame because of the slaughter of warriors in the fight between the chiefs to whom she had been promised and her lover Riachade and his men. In the version given in the Book of Lecan, however, she remained with Cuchulain when peace was concluded. This is the same Findabair who is the heroine of the story of Frauch cited above, and whose favours Cuchulain had already gained. Meanwhile, the Ulstermen had recovered from their debility and gathered for the battle with the enemy, while the goddess Morrigan uttered a song of slaughter between the armies. Med's forces were defeated, but she sent the bull by a circuitous way to Cruachan. And seeing the trackless land before him, he uttered 3 terrible bellowings, at which the Find Benach came hurrying toward him. Bricrew saw the wild combat between the maddened animals, but as they struggled, he was trampled into the earth by their hoofs. All over Ireland they drove, fighting as they went. And next day the brown bull was seen coming to Quallingy with the Find Benach in a mangled heap on his horns. Women and children wept as they beheld him, but these he slew, and then, turning his back against a hill, his heart was rent with his mighty exertions. Thus ended the Tyne. Cuchulain was now 17 years old, and to the few years which ensued before his death probably belong his amour with the goddess Fand and that with Blathnat, since Curoi intended to oppose him during the Táin, but was sent back by Med. The slaying of Curoi, of Caebre Niapar in fair fight at Ros na Rich, and of Calatin, as well as his 27 sons and his sister's son during the Táin, led to the hero's death. Calatin's wife bore posthumously 3 monstrous sons and 3 daughters, who were nurtured by Med and studied magic arts in order to compass Cuchulain's death. Joining at last with Lugaid, Curoi's son, and Erc, Caebre's son, they marched toward Ulster while his men were in their debility. Mighty efforts were made to restrain Cuchulain from a combat which all knew would be fatal to him, and he was at last concealed in the Glen of the Deaf. But Calatin's daughters discovered this and created a phantasmal army out of puffballs and withered leaves, as Luke's witches transformed into soldiers trees, swords and stones, and Gwydian trees and sedges. This army and other eldritch things filled the glen with strange noises, and Cuchulainn thought that enemies were harassing Ulster, though Cathbad told him that this was merely magic illusion. Then one of the weird daughters took the form of Niam, daughter of Celtic, and speaking in her name, bade Cuchulainn attack the foes who were overwhelming Ulster. Neither the protestations of the real Niam, nor of Dectire, nor of Conchobar, nor the assurances of Cathbad that the hosts were illusions could withhold him. On his way to Amain, he saw Bad's daughter washing blood from a warrior's gear, the washer at the ford, a prophecy of his own death. But he was resolute and cheerful in face of the desperate fight to which he bound himself. During the night, Morrigan broke his chariot, hoping thus to slay him from the combat. But next morning he bade it be yoked with the grey of Macha, though the horse reproached him. On his way, 3 crones, cooking dog's flesh with poisons and spells, called him. But since one of his gyasa was not to approach a cooking hearth, nor to eat the flesh of his namesake, that is, dog, he would have passed on, had not the crones reproached him. So he turned aside, took the flesh with his left hand, and ate it, placing his hand under his thigh, whereupon strength departed from thigh and hand. In the fight he slew many foes, until Lugaid possessed himself of Cuchulainn's spear, and wounded first the grey of Macha, which plunged into the loch for healing, and then Cuchulainn, who begged permission to crawl to the loch for water. He sat himself against a pillar stone, and there the faithful horse returned and killed many of his foes with teeth and hoofs. But at last Lugaid struck off Cuchulainn's head, though as the hero's sword fell from his grasp, it lopped off his enemy's hand. Meanwhile, Conall was met by the horse, and together they sought and found Cuchulainn's body, the grey placing its head on its master's breast. Conall pursued Lugaid, for Cuchulainn and he had vowed that whoever survived must avenge the others, and his own horse aided him, biting a piece from Lugaid's side, while Conall cut off his head, thus taking vengeance for the hero's death. Lugaid, Curoi's son, was called Mac na Trí Con, or son of the 3 dogs, that is, Curoi, Cuchulainn, and Conall, Con being the genitive of Cu, or dog, because it was believed that his mother Blathnat, Curoi's wife, had loved these 2 as well as her husband. Thus Lugaid killed one reputed father of his, and was himself slain by another. A 10th century poem calls the 3 flags of his grave murder, disgrace, and treachery. He was probably not Cuchulainn's friend Lugaid Red Stripes, who, however, was also a son of 3 fathers, Bres, Nar, and Lothar, by their sister Clothru. In his old age, Conall retired to the court of Med, who induced him to slay Ailill. But for this one, the 3 Reds, or wolves, killed him and cut off his head in revenge for the death of Curoi at the hands of Cuchulainn. Conchobar met his fate in a curious way. Among the trophies in Amain, Macha was a sling ball made of the brain of Mesegra, king of Leinster, slain by Conall. One day Set, whom Conall killed at the feast on Mac Datho's boar, stole this ball, which was mixed with earth and thus hardened, and later induced the women of Connaught to get Conchobar to show himself to them, whereupon Set flung the ball into his forehead, whence it could not be removed, lest he should die. Years after, an earthquake occurred, and when his druid told him that this signified our Lord's crucifixion, Conchobar, who now believed in God, felt such emotion at not being able to avenge Christ that the ball started from his head, and he died. Mosier Diarbois maintained that the saga of Cuchulainn was known in Gaul. Cuchulainn's name Setanta is akin to that of the Setanti, Celtic tribes living in the district between the Ribble and Morecambe Bay, and this, according to Rhys, suggests a British ancestry for the Irish hero. D'Arbois, on the other hand, regards this folk, as well as the Brigantes, as of Belgic Gaulish provenance, while the latter had colonies in Ireland. They had a well-known god, Esus, whom D'Arbois identifies with Cuchulainn, whence the story is of Gaulish origin, perhaps taught by the Druids, and it was ultimately carried to Ulster, where it was received with enthusiasm. The identification rests on certain figured monuments, in the persons, names, or episodes, of which D'Arbois sees those of the saga. On one altar, Esus is cutting down a tree, while on the same altar is figured a bull on which are perched 3 birds, this animal being entitled Tarvos Trigaramnos, the bull with 3 cranes, or Garanus, unless the cranes are a rebus for the 3 horns, or Caranos, of divine animals. On another altar from Treves, a god is cutting down a tree, and in its branches are a bull's head and 2 birds, a possible combination of the incidents on the other altar. D'Arbois regards this as illustrating the Tyne. Esus, the woodman, is Cuchulainn. His action depicts what the hero did, cutting down trees to bar the way of Medb's host. Esus is derived from words meaning anger, rapid motion, such as Cuchulainn often displayed. The bull is the brown bull. The birds are the forms in which Morrigan and her sisters appeared, though these bird forms were those of the crow, not the crane. The personal name Donotaurus is found in Gaul and is the equivalent of the Don Tarb, or the brown bull. Again, Diodorus says that the Dioscuri, that is, Castor and Pollux, were the gods most worshipped by the Celts in the west of Gaul, and D'Arbois finds these in Cuchulainn and Conall Cernach, the former being foster brother of the latter, having been suckled by Findochoin, Conall's mother. He bases this identification on an altar found at Paris, on the 4 sides of which are represented the Roman Castor and Pollux and 2 Gaulish divinities, Smertullos attacking a serpent with a club, and an unnamed horned god, perhaps the god Cernunnos. Smertullo is therefore the native equivalent of Pollux, Cernunnos of Castor, and at the same time Smertullos is Cuchulainn, and Cernunnos is Conall Cernach. In the Táin, Cuchulainn vanquished Morrigan as an eel, the serpent of the monument, and again, to hide his youthfulness, he smeared his chin with a false beard. As for Conall Cernach, whose epithet means victorious, D'Arbois connects it also with the hypothetical Cernu, or horn, though Conall is never said to be horned. Lug, Cuchulainn's father, was a widely worshipped Celtic god, his equivalent in Gaul being a hypothetical Lugus, whose name appears in place names there. As Lug was called Samil Danach, or skilled in many arts, Lugus may be the Gaulish god equated by Caesar with Mercury, whom he calls inventor of all arts, and associates with the simulacra, or standing stones of Gaul. Now on one of these, at Cervadel, 4 bas-reliefs were sculptured in Gallo-Roman times, one of them depicting the god Mercury together with a smaller childish figure. And D'Arbois assumes that this represents the god Lug with his son Cuchulainn. Tempting as these identifications are, it must be confessed that they rest upon comparatively slender evidence and on what may be merely apparent coincidences, while they are of an extremely speculative character.